Thank you. We'll come to order. Without objection, the chair is empowered to declare a recess at any time. Today, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence will hold an open hearing to discuss how the Kremlin uses financial leverage and corruption as tools of intelligence operations and foreign policy. The hearing will explore the dynamics between the Kremlin and Russia's business elites and oligarchs. President Vladimir Putin's control over the economy, Russian banks and the oligarchs, the use of financial entanglements as a means of compromise, and the derivation and importance of sanctions to the Russian economy, particularly Putin's inner circle. The goals of the hearing are, number one, to provide the American public with a foundational understanding of the Kremlin's use of financial leverage to influence foreign policy. And number two, the importance of counterintelligence operations and investigations as distinguished from criminal investigations. Almost exactly 2 years ago, James Comey disclosed publicly for the first time in testimony before this committee that the FBI had initiated a counterintelligence investigation into Russia's interference in the 2016 election. While that investigation would lead Special Counsel Mueller to initiate a great many criminal proceedings, resulting in numerous indictments and convictions, it began and has continued as a counterintelligence investigation. What does that mean? Counterintelligence investigations are designed, among other things, to determine whether any U.S. persons, and in particular those in positions of influence in government or business, may be vulnerable to foreign influence, manipulation, coercion, or compromise by a hostile foreign power. This notion of compromise, or kompromat in Russian, can be subtle and discreet, it can be witting or unwitting, and it can take many forms. But it is at the heart of Russia's playbook to sow discord in democratic institutions, create leverage that can influence foreign and national security policy, both here and abroad, and encourage nations to act contrary to our security interests or theirs. We do not yet know the results of the counterintelligence investigation initiated by Comey and then continued by Mueller. It is not clear whether or to what extent the Mueller report, which is focused on prosecutorial decisions, will even discuss counterintelligence findings. But the counterintelligence concerns that animated the investigation in the first place may ultimately have the more profound impact on security and policy, and we therefore await the publication of the Mueller report to find out. Today we have an expert panel that will help us explore how Russia uses intelligence tools to influence foreign nations, both the United States and others. And we will have a particular focus on Russia's use of financial leverage to achieve their goals. Our esteemed panelists will address the interplay between business, government, and intelligence in Vladimir Putin's Russia, how Putin uses business and corruption to maintain control at home and influence foreign policy, and finally, we will delve into the issues of sanctions and why sanctions relief was so central to Russia's foreign policy or foreign influence campaign and remains a preoccupation of Putin's today. Let me now take a moment to introduce our panelists. Mike McFaul served as the U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014 and is currently director of the Freeman Spigoli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, where he is also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Stephen Hall is the former CIA chief of Russia operations and enjoyed a 30-year career in the agency. Heather Conley is a senior vice president for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and is also the author of the Kremlin Playbook. And Eric Lorber is a senior director at the Center on Economic and Financial Power. Thank you all for joining us today. I now yield to the ranking member for any opening remarks he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we will hear from a panel on Russian oligarchs. Challenges emanating from Russia have been an abiding topic of this committee for many years. In fact, under the Obama administration, committee Republicans repeatedly warned the administration, both privately and publicly, that more resources and better intelligence were needed to counter numerous threats to our national security from the Kremlin. Our advice, however, was not heeded. The Obama administration's approach to Russia was characterized by misspelled reset buttons, direct promises of more flexibility after Obama's re-election, the scrapping of our missile defense plans in Poland and the Czech Republic at Russia's behest, and the ridicule of then-candidate Mitt Romney for identifying Russia as our primary geopolitical foe, all under an administration that watched helplessly while Russia marched into Ukraine and annexed Crimea. This committee should be focused on intelligence oversight and making sure the IC has resources and authorities needed to protect the United States. We should not be used as a platform to spread false information and bizarre conspiracies. We have unique capabilities and authorities to do crucial oversight work, and now, frankly speaking, that is not being done. This committee was created to oversee the intelligence community, not serve as a tribunal launching frivolous accusations and investigations of one party's political opponent.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yield to Mr. Conaway.
Mr. Chairman, since prior to the inauguration of President Trump in January of 2017, you've been at the center of a well-orchestrated media campaign claiming, among other things, the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government. Indeed, before the appointment of Robert Mueller as special counsel, you alleged during one of your frequent television interviews that there was, quote, more than circumstantial evidence, quote, of collusion, but that you could, quote, not go into the particulars, close quote. Your repeated public statements, which implied knowledge of classified facts supporting the collusion allegations, occurred at the same time anonymous leaks of alleged intelligence and law enforcement information were appearing in the media. These leaks were often sourced to current or former administration or intelligence officials, appear to support the collusion allegations, and were purported to be related to ongoing investigations of President Trump and his associates. As you know, the committee has long been aware of and actively engaged in intelligence oversight activities related to Russians' malign activities. As part of our duty to oversee the actions of the intelligence community, we conducted a thorough investigation related to the 2016 Russian efforts to interfere in our elections. This investigation included a review of the allegations that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia. The committee found no evidence that President Trump or anyone associated with the Trump campaign colluded, coordinated, or conspired with the Russian government. The minority views, which you submitted, were attached to our committee's findings, and yet your views did not provide any evidence to support the claim of collusion. On March 24, 2019, the special counsel delivered his findings to the government, to the special counsel's investigation did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with conspired or coordinated with Russia in its efforts to influence the 2016 presidential election. Special Counsel Mueller's findings are consistent with those of this committee, as well as the public statements of various senators on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Despite these findings, you continue to proclaim to the media that there is significant evidence of collusion. You further have stated you will continue to investigate the counterintelligence issues. That is the president or people around him compromised in any way by hostile foreign power? Your willingness to continue to promote a demonstrably false narrative is alarming. The findings of the special counsel conclusively refute your past and present assertions and have exposed you as having abused your position to knowingly promote false information, having damaged the integrity of this committee and undermined the faith in the United States government and its institutions. Your actions, both past and present, are incompatible with your duty as chairman of this committee, which alone in the House of Representatives has the obligation and authority to provide effective oversight of the U.S. intelligence community. As such, we have no faith in your ability to discharge your duties in a manner consistent with your constitutional responsibility and urge your immediate resignation as chairman of the committee. Mr. Chairman, this letter is signed by all 9 members of the Republican side of the House, of the committee, and I ask unanimous consent to be entered into the record of today's hearing. I yield back.
Without objection, I'm going to turn to our witnesses who are the subject of the hearing today, but before I do, and as you have chosen, instead of addressing the hearing to simply attack me, consistent with the President's attacks, I do want to respond in this way. My colleagues may think it's okay that the Russians offered dirt on a Democratic candidate for president as part of what was described as the Russian government's effort to help the Trump campaign. You might think that's okay. My colleagues might think it's okay that when that was offered to the son of the president, who had a pivotal role in the campaign, that the president's son did not call the FBI. He did not adamantly refuse that foreign help. No, instead, that son said that he would love the help of the Russians. You might think it's okay that he took that meeting. You might think it's okay that Paul Manafort, the campaign chair, someone with great experience in running campaigns, also took that meeting. You might think it's okay that the president's son-in-law also took that meeting. You might think it's okay that they concealed it from the public. You might think it's okay that their only disappointment after that meeting was that the dirt they received on Hillary Clinton wasn't better. You might think that's okay. You might think it's okay that when it was discovered a year later that they lied about that meeting and said it was about adoptions. You might think it's okay that the president is reported to have helped dictate that lie. You might think that's okay. I don't. You might think it's okay that the campaign chairman of a presidential campaign would offer information about that campaign to a Russian oligarch in exchange for money or debt forgiveness. You might think that's okay. I don't. You might think it's okay that that campaign chairman offered polling data, campaign polling data to someone linked to Russian intelligence. I don't think that's okay. You might think it's okay that the president himself called on Russia to hack his opponent's emails if they were listening. You might think it's okay that later that day, in fact, the Russians attempted to hack a server affiliated with that campaign. I don't think that's okay. You might think that it's okay that the president's son-in-law sought to establish a secret back channel of communications with the Russians through a Russian diplomatic facility. I don't think that's okay. You might think it's okay that an associate of the president made direct contact with the GRU through Guccifer II and WikiLeaks and is considered a hostile intelligence agency. You might think that it's okay a senior campaign official was instructed to reach that associate and find out what that hostile intelligence agency had to say in terms of dirt on his opponent. You might think it's okay that the National Security Advisor designate secretly conferred with a Russian ambassador about undermining U.S. sanctions, and you might think it's okay he lied about it to the FBI. You might say that's all okay. You might say that's just what you need to do to win. But I don't think it's okay. I think it's immoral. I think it's unethical. I think it's unpatriotic. And yes, I think it's corrupt and evidence of collusion. Now, I have always said that the question of whether this amounts to proof of conspiracy was another matter. Whether the special counsel could prove beyond a reasonable doubt the proof of that crime would be up to the special counsel, and I would accept his decision, and I do. He's a good and honorable man, and he is a good prosecutor. But I do not think that conduct, criminal or not, is okay. And the day we do think that's okay is the day we will look back and say that is the day America lost its way. And I will tell you one more thing that is apropos of the hearing today. I don't think it's okay that during a presidential campaign, Mr. Trump sought the Kremlin's help to consummate a real estate deal in Moscow that would make him a fortune. According to the special counsel, hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't think it's okay that he concealed it from the public. I don't think it's okay that he advocated a new and more favorable policy towards the Russians, even as he was seeking the Russians' help, the Kremlin's help to make money. I don't think it's okay that his attorney lied to our committee. There's a different word for that than collusion, and it's called compromise. And that is the subject of our hearing today. Mr. Ambassador, you are recognized for your opening statement. I will not yield. Mr. Ambassador,
you gentlemen, yield because you just made some things about all of us that I think we all should get the opportunity to respond to. If you're going to say we think, you ought to allow us to speak of what we think.
You can use your 5 minutes to speak. You attacked me in your opening statement, and
I have not had an opportunity to respond at all, especially to your statements of what we think, because no one over here thinks that. No one over here. I mean, you cannot speak for us. You cannot speak for us.
Ms. Turner, you're not recognized. Ambassador McFaul, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Nunes and everybody else that's here today. I want to start with some good news. The ideological struggle between communism and capitalism during the Cold War is over. That's the end of my good news. The bad news is that there is a new ideological fight between Putinism in the West, and it's only just begun. And in my estimation, we as a country are underestimating it, and we're not focused enough on it. And that's what I want to address in my brief remarks today. Putin defines this contest as a battle between the decadent, liberal, multilateral West that dominates and is anchored by the United States of America, and what he calls his brand, not my brand, of conservative sovereign values. I define this contest as one between autocracy, corruption, state domination of the economy, and indifference to international rules, laws, and norms versus democracy, rule of law, free markets, and respect for international law. As I wrote in my detailed written remarks with lots of footnotes, forgive me, I am a professor, but I'll only summarize briefly today, Putin uses oligarchs' money and intelligence to wage this battle at home and abroad. To contain and deter Putinism, we must better understand the nature of the threat, and that's why I'm honored to be here today to talk a bit about that. My remarks are divided into three different parts: the evolution of Putin's system of government at home, second, illustration of how Putin seeks to export his ideas and practices abroad, and third, time permitting, a specific focus on Putin's effort to lift sanctions on Russian individuals and companies. Let me go through those three, time permitting. First, Putinism at home. I think we all in this committee especially know the general contours of it, but let me remind you of just several specifics and trends. First, Putin started right away in 2000 to roll back checks and balances on executive power, focusing first and foremost on controlling the media, understanding quite well how central that is for autocracy, and that's why he's focused on the internationalization of Russian media to export his ideas abroad. Second, after 2 decades of Putin's rule, the Russian regime has become more autocratic over time. Every term that he served, he's now in his 4th term, it's become more autocratic, not less. Third, during this period, the FSB, the Federal Security Service, one of the successor organizations to the KGB, has played a growing role in running both the state and the economy. Russian intelligence officers today play a much greater role in ruling Russia than the KGB ever played during the Soviet Union. Fourth, Putin has used the redistribution of property rights among Russia's oligarchs as a central tool for ruling Russia. Now, of course, it's true that he enriches his friends and cronies through this redistribution, but it's also a way that he rules Russia. If he decides who's rich and who's not, that makes those that become rich on his watch completely dependent on him. Also, by seizing assets, he keeps everybody on their toes. Fifth, and not surprisingly, therefore, the growing arbitrary and pernicious role of the state in the Russian economy has stifled economic growth. And to justify this form of rule and poor economic performance, therefore, Putin needs an external enemy, and that is us. Second, exporting Putinism. Putin actively seeks to propagate his ideas of governance and conservative values, and I want to keep emphasizing, as defined by him, not me. I don't consider it conservatism. But he seeks to court both ideological allies to win them and to weaken his ideological foes, not just between states, but within states, including the United States of America. He's developed several instruments of power to try to do this. First, he and his government have invested heavily in international media. RT, $300 million budget a year. Sputnik International, very active on American social media platforms. RT claims to be the most watched media company on YouTube today. And all of these organizations were active in influencing voter preferences in 2016. Second, Putin and his proxies set up organizations, fake identities, bots to influence public opinion around the world, including the United States of America. I urge you to go back and read the indictment from Mr. Mueller of the Internet Research Agency. It is outrageous what the Russians did, violating our sovereignty in 2016, and I urge you to read every word of it and think about what we need to do to prevent it in the future. Third, Putin has deployed his intelligence agencies to steal information from foes and then publish this information in ways to weaken his enemies, be they individuals or nation states. Fourth, the Kremlin actively cultivates direct contacts and ongoing relationships with individuals, NGOs, political parties, religious groups, and individual politicians sympathetic to Putinism. Fifth, in parallel, Putin uses money, corruption, and property rights abroad to influence foreign policy. Rosneft and Gazprom, just to take two instances, are instruments of Putinism, not profit-maximizing companies. And finally, rarely, but sometimes, he uses very coercive agents, including soldiers, to advance Putinism abroad, as he did most dramatically in 2014 in Ukraine. I see I've gone over my time. I have some things to say about sanctions. Maybe we'll get back to that in questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Hall.
Good morning. Happy to be here with you today to share my thoughts on Vladimir Putin's Russia, gleaned from working in the CIA's clandestine service for over 30 years. During my time at CIA, from when I started out as a line case officer through when I retired in 2015 as a member of the Senior Intelligence Service, most of my time and efforts were focused on Russia. I retired as the chief of Central Eurasia Division, responsible for managing CIA's Russian operations worldwide. I'm not a trained Russian historian. I'm not an analyst. Rather, my views on Putin's Russia come from my experiences as a former intelligence officer. I believe that's an important perspective, and here's why. I'm often asked for my thoughts on who Putin really is, what makes him tick, how he thinks, how much of a threat is he really? My best response is that Vladimir Putin is first and foremost a Chekist, whose primary goal is the weakening of democracy in the United States and the West. The Cheka was the Lenin-era secret police, the precursor to the KGB, of which Putin was a member, as well as the modern-day Russian intelligence services. It was the Cheka and its successors that built and ran the Soviet system of concentration camps, the Gulag. It was the Cheka that executed thousands of its own citizens in the basement of the Lubyanka, its headquarters in Moscow. The history of the Russian intelligence services is one of unalloyed brutality. Every year on the 20th of December, Chekist Day, Vladimir Putin calls and congratulates the members of the Russian intelligence services on their historical successes. This is how seriously Putin views his role as a Chekist. These Chekist traditions persist in Russia today. I once had a conversation with a Russian intelligence officer who made the argument that all countries, even Western democracies, had intelligence agencies. The Russian argued that the CIA was not that different from the KGB. I disagreed vehemently. CIA has certainly made its share of mistakes over the decades, but we have never built concentration camps to imprison Americans, nor did we murder American citizens in the basement of Langley or anywhere else for that matter. I mention this story because it illustrates the need for the West, and particularly the United States, to resist the temptation of seeing Putin's Russia through a Western lens. Most Americans were raised to believe in things like fair play, giving others the benefit of the doubt, and a generally optimistic outlook on life. Putin and his lieutenants understand this, and they use this outlook effectively against us. Look, they argue, we have many similarities. Indeed, when I was most recently in Moscow, I could walk down the street and visit McDonald's for a Big Mac or drop into Starbucks for a latte. There are large, luxurious hotels, some of them American change. Businesses appear to be operating normally. There are even governmental structures that seem comfortably similar. There's the Duma, which looks a little bit like Congress. There's a president, a prime minister, positions we as Westerners have heard of and can relate to. But what one really sees in Moscow is a thin veneer of normalcy designed to cover how things really work. Putin's Russia is an autocratic Chekist system. It's a kleptocracy run by the mob in the Kremlin, many of whom worked formerly for the Russian security services. I'm also asked often about Russian organized crime. Again, it's important to avoid asking this question through a Western lens. Broadly, Putin runs Russia as a crime boss, runs his organizations. Those who Putin finds useful and effective, he rewards. If someone falls out of favor, punishment usually follows. Enemies of the Putin organization, either internal or external, are neutralized. Independent journalists are killed. Political opponents are flooded with lawsuits, incarcerated, or assassinated. Oligarchs are not exempt, and Putin uses his intelligence services to collect damaging information on all of them, just in case they fail to produce for him in the future. Like fast food restaurants in Moscow, the rule of law in Russia is a caricature created to make us in the West believe that Putin's system really is not that bad. Like any place run by the mafia, businesses, foreign and Russian, are allowed to operate, but only under the rules set by the mob, in this case the Kremlin. Prior to my retirement, both staff in HIPSI and CSIS asked for CIA's thoughts on the Kaspersky Labs, a cyber and technology company run by Eugene Kaspersky. My response was that Kaspersky understood that when Putin or one of his men called and needed something from the company, he had no choice but to comply. When Putin knows in which Russian banks your fortunes are held, when he knows your net worth, when he knows where your wife and your children and your mother live, you do as you're told. If you flaunt the system, it usually doesn't end well. Ask Mikhail Khodorkovsky, a rich Russian oligarch who Putin sent to jail for almost 10 years on trumped-up charges, now in exile in the UK. Getting out of Russia, however, does not necessarily protect even once powerful oligarchs and other enemies of the state. Putin is the intellectual author of dozens of murders and attempted assassinations abroad. People like Alexander Litvinenko, poisoned by radioactive tea, Sergei Skripal and his daughter, attacked by GRU, the GRU using a Russian nerve agent, and the former oligarch Boris Berezovsky, found hanged in his London home. These are all lessons from which other powerful Russians understand well. This is a key component to how the oligarch system works in Russia. Putin will help you become very rich as an oligarch and allow you to maintain your riches as long as you support the Kremlin when required. If you fail, the consequences, as noted above, are severe. Over the past several years, Putin has included the oligarchy as part of his larger reliance on hybrid warfare against the United States and the West. We now need to understand that in addition to defending against conventional attacks from Russia, Putin is also using non-traditional means to threaten us, to include using his oligarchs. Maria Butina's association with several oligarchs and her work for Russia in the United States is a good example of this. Putin controls Russia and his oligarchs using a complex system which bears many of the traits of a Czechist state. The intelligence services play a key role in neutralizing both internal and external threats. Internally, Putin uses the FSB, the Investigative Committee, and other entities to gather information against companies and individuals that can be leveraged later should they need to be brought back into line. Putin can also use his oligarchs to exert economic and financial pressure on targets inside and outside of Russia. The Kremlin also controls the information that flows to the majority of the Russians, and so anti-West and pro-Putin propaganda themes keep most Russians where Putin wants them, under his control. The same organized crime rules hold for foreign businesses in Russia. Putin will have his intelligence services collect intelligence on any American businessman in which he has an interest. Such efforts would include both physical surveillance as well as audio and visual collection against the target while in Russia. Entrapment and arrest have been used against American businessmen in the past. More recently, Russian intelligence framed and arrested American businessman Paul Whelan, who, as far as I understand, is still languishing in a Russian prison. All of the Russian intelligence services play important roles in collecting the information which can be used to control all businesses, foreign and domestic, in Russia. This is not to say that foreign businesses have never been successful in Russia. What it is to say is that success is contingent upon the Kremlin's approval of such business activity. If an American business person runs afoul of the Kremlin, all of the compromat collected against him or her can be quickly and efficiently leveraged. The Russian intelligence services are expert at collecting compromising information that can later be used to blackmail anyone Putin wants. They have collected information against American business people in the past. They have collected against me and my family while I was in Russia, as well as Ambassador McFaul. If you have ever traveled to Russia, any of you, you've been collected against as well. No one is immune. In an open session like this, I won't be able to address in great detail what I know of how the Russian intelligence services specifically do their work. I cannot risk exposing the sources and methods of our own intelligence services, nor those of our allies, who often work very closely with us on counterintelligence issues. But I would be more than happy to address any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Ms. Conley.
Chairman Schiff, Ranking Member Nunes, distinguished members of this committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you some of the research that CSIS has conducted regarding the patterns and methodology of Russian malign economic influence. We've analyzed 11 European countries. We've entitled this body of research the Kremlin Playbook, and we've just released our second report in this series. And Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I would like to place that report in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Congressman Nunes, you're absolutely right. Russian malign influence has been working for many, many years. In fact, our Central and Eastern European allies told us very clearly of that, even as far back as 2009. But before I dive into the Russian malign economic influence, I think it's important for us to take a quick step back to understand how Russia is weaponizing illicit financing and creating what I call a financial gray zone, and place that into a broader context. What we are living through is the Russian military doctrine of new generation warfare. It is a strategy of influence, not of force. It's designed to erode the confidence and credibility of democracies to such a point that those democracies will seek an accommodation with the Kremlin's policies and the interests over their own national interests. There is no advanced U.S. weapons system that can push back against this. Russia competes with the United States where we are at our most vulnerable. It exploits every weakness, every societal division, everything, faith, history, how and what kind of information we read, racial tensions, partisanship, illicit financing, failed privatizations, cyber attacks, each separately and in combination, and all have one objective: to diminish America's strength. An advisor to President Putin, Vladislav Surkov, recently summarized the power of new generation warfare, I think, quite nicely. I quote, "Foreign politicians talk about Russia's interference in elections and referendums around the world. In fact, the matter is even more serious. Russia interferes in your brains. We change your conscience, and there is nothing you can do about it." Well, there is something that we can do and must do. But let's be clear, although this hearing is about what Russia does, and we need to have a much better understanding of how Russia penetrates our institutions and our democratic processes to prevent it. This is about strengthening our own democratic house and minimizing our divisions. Our patriotism must be greater than our partisanship. By downgrading our democracy or degrading it, the Kremlin seeks to demonstrate the moral equivalency between Putinism or managed democracy, because if there's no difference, we can reach that accommodation. But democracies are very, very different from authoritarian and kleptocratic regimes, and it is the requirement that democracy be transparent and accountable, and that is, in fact, the place where our research begins. How do we enhance transparency and accountability of our own systems and institutions? This is where the battle is now being waged, and democracies, unfortunately, have begun to mirror and facilitate kleptocratic functions. As Russian funds are laundered through our financial system, shell corporations and subsidiaries are formed to circumvent taxes. This is what we fight. In Mr. Putin's worldview, everyone and everything has a price, and we must firmly state that democracy is priceless. These illicit figures are absolutely eye-watering, as I note in my written testimony. When we began this research, I had anticipated that Russian investments would be diminished in Europe, particularly after the imposition of US and EU sanctions in 2004. But this is not the case. The size of the inbound and outbound financial flows, both illicit and perfectly legal, have all become a very powerful tool of Russian malign economic influence. And just a very brief example, in the countries that we analyzed, Italy, Austria, and the Netherlands alone, Russian foreign direct investment stocks have expanded from 5 billion euros in 2006 to 160 billion at the end of 2017. In the Netherlands alone, Russian company assets have jumped from 13.2 billion euros in 2007 to 96 billion euros in 2017. So we're seeing a growth of Russia's economic influence in Europe, not a reduction. And so as these illicit funds are being used, they're funding European political parties and individuals which share the Kremlin's agenda and objectives, and that is working against U.S. security and strategic interest. They are used to deepen economic dependency on the Kremlin. We call this the unvirtuous cycle of malign influence. It appears that many individuals prove Mr. Putin right. They do have a price, and it can be easily paid. But how we fight and win this battle is to fight through greater transparency and democratic accountability. We need to prioritize illicit financing as much as we do terrorism financing. Examples of Danske Bank, Swedbank, Deutsche Bank, Société Générale, corporate service providers, opaque beneficial ownership. We must work collaboratively with our European partners to detect illicit financing and push it out of our system. We need to make sure that the highest transparency standards are there for ultimate beneficial ownership. This is how we strengthen our democracy. Mr. Chairman, this is how we win. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lorber, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Nunes, and distinguished members of the committee. I'm honored to appear before you today. As this committee knows well, Russia poses a serious national security challenge to the United States. In the last few years alone, Russia has illegally occupied Crimea, destabilized Ukraine, attempted to subvert Western democracies, including by attacking the integrity of U.S. elections, launched cyber attacks against the United States and our allies, supported the murderous Assad regime in Syria, and used chemical weapons to conduct assassinations in Western Europe. The United States and its partners must respond forcefully and thoughtfully to this threat, including through the use of targeted economic measures. As an economic sanctions and illicit finance compliance professional, I will focus my testimony today on 3 key points. First, our sanctions on Russia have had an impact. Through the use of coercive economic measures, we have put pressure on particular Russian targets and caused economic pain to the Russian economy. Second, this impact has been limited, and while resulting in some changes in Russian behavior, is unlikely to significantly alter Russian decision-making, absent an escalation that would both be costly to our partners in Europe and many in the private sector. And third, we need to look beyond sanctions to additional economic measures, to my colleague's point, to include tracking, tracing, and preventing illicit Russian funds from entering the legitimate international financial system as a way to counter certain types of Russian malign influence and activity. This requires strengthening the anti-money laundering, combating the financing of terrorism, AML-CFT, backbone of the international financial system. Such an approach would make our sanctions programs more effective. One of the primary challenges in any sanctions program is effective implementation. While it is relatively easy to screen transactions, customers, and counterparties for names of sanctioned parties, Russian oligarchs and sanctioned persons are adept at hiding their identities and involvement in efforts to move funds around the world. The real work to make these programs effective takes place when conducting investigations into the ultimate beneficial owners of companies, unmasking front and shell companies, and working to determine sources of funds. To the extent that the United States and its allies bolster their AML-CFT regimes and the requirements they impose on financial institutions, they will be more likely to catch Russian illicit actors trying to use their institutions to move funds. Such an approach would also have the added benefit of strengthening our defenses against illicit financing more broadly. To bolster our AML-CFT regime and to counter sanctions evasion and illicit finance, Congress can take a number of steps. First, Congress can pass meaningful beneficial ownership information. Even as the United States continues to enhance and expand its financial tools to combat various national security threats, these efforts are undermined by the exploitation by anonymous legal entities. Foreign adversaries can use anonymous companies for a range of purposes here in the United States alone, including undermining the efficacy of important laws such as the Foreign Agents Registration Act and campaign finance laws. While it is important to push foreign partners to require companies to collect, maintain, and disclose accurate beneficial ownership information at the time of company formation, we must also follow the same standard here in the United States and pass such legislation. Second, resource implementation and enforcement. The counter-illicit finance apparatus in the United States government is small and the budget spartan, given the outsized role that the professionals at Treasury and the relevant law enforcement, intelligence, and regulatory agencies are asked to play in safeguarding national security. Given that Treasury is being asked to address an ever-growing set of national security challenges, Congress should provide them with significantly increased resources to ensure it is able to address the challenges at hand. And third, call upon FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, to issue an advisory on Russia's sanctions evasion and money laundering red flags. FinCEN regularly promulgates guidance to U.S. financial institutions identifying red flags related to illicit finance risks. To assist financial institutions in disrupting illicit Russian financial flows, Congress should call upon the Treasury Department to issue an advisory detailing red flags associated with Russian illicit fund flows. In addition, Congress should also call upon FinCEN to coordinate an advisory with international partner financial intelligence units. Such a coordinated advisory would further assist foreign financial institutions in detecting and preventing the abuse of their institutions by illicit Russian actors. Increased transparency, additional sanctions, and cooperation with partners on additional economic pressure can have an impact on Vladimir Putin and his cronies and the regime. But while these tools are powerful, this committee, Congress, and the administration more generally should not labor under the misconception that our economic authorities are a silver bullet to counter Russian malign activities. I'd be happy to discuss any of the particular recommendations I put forth, as well as sanctions on Russia more broadly. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lorber. Mr. Hall, can you explain a bit about how the Kremlin uses business and finance as a counterintelligence tool?
Sure. I think the best way to look at it, again, is to imagine the Russian intelligence services and the Putin regime, the Kremlin itself, as collectors of information first and foremost. And unlike in our own intelligence community, where we oftentimes, if not almost exclusively, collect information for policymaking purposes, in Russia, what's collected is information that can then be used economically, if necessary, against targets of Putin's choosing and against the targets that the Russian intelligence services might choose. So that's a very powerful tool because, of course, when you're looking at how to leverage people, how to get people to do what it is that you want them to do, finance is their own personal economic, and of course they're also just their professional persona, oftentimes come into play in terms of what motivates people and how you can best leverage that. The Russian intelligence services are very active in doing precisely that.
And how might they use financial entanglement beyond for the purpose of gathering counterintelligence, but for the purpose of either gathering compromise, or seeking to influence foreign decision-making?
I would say both is the answer to that. The first is the easy part for them. Collecting compromising information, kompromat, as we all know now the word in Russian, is what not only the FSB, the internal service, the SVR, the external service, the GRU, the entire security structure in Russia has been doing that for decades, if not arguably centuries. So this is something that they're set up to do. Whenever anybody comes to Russia, goes to Russia, that type of collection will be initiated against targets of interest. And what is gathered from those operations, from those collection operations, is either stored for later use or it can be simply used immediately. And the same holds true for financial information. I'm not sure if I got the second part of what your question was.
Well, let me ask you this. Do the Russians engage through their oligarchs? Does the Kremlin engage through their oligarchs in illicit financial transactions with an eye to the fact that it may be useful in the future to hold those illicit transactions as compromise over the targets of those transactions?
Sure, that would certainly be consistent with some of the things that the Russian intelligence services have done in the past. Again, the goal is to collect compromising information that can indeed be used for any number of different activities against a given target down the road. So whether it is financial information, business information, or some things, just different things motivate different human beings, they will collect on all of those things in an effort to leverage those things to get people to do what they want them to do.
And can that financial entanglement take the form of money laundering?
Yes, absolutely. The Russians have a long history of money laundering, not just for the purposes of avoiding sanctions and that sort of thing, but in basic intelligence operations when they want their operations to be funded in a certain way that is not easily discoverable. There may be some folks in Caribbean islands someplace who money launder better than the Russians do, but the Russians are right up there.
Ambassador McFaul, in your written testimony, you talk about or make reference to the effort to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. Viewing this from the Russian perspective, let me ask you a couple things. If a presidential candidate sought to make a major real estate deal in Moscow during the campaign, is that something that would have come to the attention of Vladimir Putin?
I don't know. I want to be clear. I think we should know the facts of that. Let me speak generally that over the course of time in Russia, to do big business deals requires permission from the Kremlin. Anders Oslin, one of my colleagues at the Atlantic Council, has just written a fantastic book, if I can recommend it to you all, coming out in May. And he estimates that any deal over $1 billion has to get direct approval from the Kremlin. And remember, just to build on some things that Steve said, Putin is using that not just as a way to enrich his friends and redistribute property to enrich his friends, but he's also doing that to make those people loyal. And here I mean domestic and foreign. If you want to do a major multi-billion-dollar transaction in Russia, you need to coordinate and be loyal to President Putin. That's a very different, I just want to echo another thing Steve said. You don't have to do that in the United States of America, right? Thankfully, we don't have that. But in that system, with the state being at the center of everything, you have to have, at a minimum, that kind of coordination with the Kremlin.
You know, there are public reports that the Trump organization sought to enlist the help of Dmitry Peskov.
Yes.
Can you tell us who Dmitry Peskov is? How close is he to Putin? And how would Mr. Peskov view that kind of overture or request for assistance coming from the business of a presidential candidate?
So I know Dmitry Peskov. I haven't seen him for 5 years because I'm on the Russian sanctions list, so I haven't been there recently. But when I was ambassador, I used to deal with him closely. He's not just the press secretary for the president, as is commonly reported. He's a very close advisor to President Putin. Has aspirations for other bigger jobs, by the way. To be honest, I think it's rather naive for somebody to try to call Peskov to do a business deal. But I think that reflects a common perception that you have to deal with the Kremlin. I think there are more sophisticated ways that you would do that, but most certainly he has the public image of being very close to Putin, and if you were looking for a way to get to Putin, most certainly you'd try to reach out to Mr. Peskov.
And what about the necessity of obtaining financing from one of the major Russian banks? Can you tell us about the relationship between those banks and the Kremlin and how the Kremlin uses those as an instrument of state policy?
Well, all the three major banks, and even the fourth and fifth bank, but the three big ones, the Bear Bank, VEB, and VTB, are all owned by the government. Remember that always. I think there's variation in the way that those banks operate in the world. I think Sberbank operates a little bit more like a normal bank. They have deposits and they seek business opportunities. VEB is different. I think that's the one you're referring to. VEB is not really a bank. It's completely controlled by the Kremlin. It's referred to in the press in Russia as Putin's bank. The former head of it, I think you mentioned him in your opening remarks, Sergei Gorkov, was also an intelligence officer. The new head of it is Igor Shuvalov, somebody I used to work very closely with. He used to be the deputy prime minister, really in charge of the government in terms of economic policy. And it's completely controlled and acts on the behalf of the Kremlin.
Ms. Conley, one of the running themes through the last couple of years has been an effort by the Russians to do away with sanctions on Russia over its interference in our election, over its invasion of Crimea. Can you talk about the centrality of efforts to do away with sanctions, which we have seen so recurrently in our investigation? Why is that such a top priority for the Kremlin?
Mr. Chairman, it's important because Vladimir Putin has to manage a very challenging long-term decline of the Russian economy. He needs those sanctions to be lifted, particularly in the financial space, to allow needed funds to come into the Russian economy. So this is, in some ways, it's always about regime survival, but the economic means are very important. Because the sanctions have been tailored to many members of his inner circle, that also increases pressure on that as well. We had anticipated that the European Union individual members might challenge the longstanding EU sanctions. They have not, which is very positive. But in our research, what we found is, but we can't be comforted even by our own sanctions regime. While it has been very helpful, what we're seeing is patterns of shifting changes. Now it's about incorporating and through subsidiaries new monetary flows that are going through, a lot of sanctions that have been grandfathered. So we're actually not seeing, I think, as much power of those sanctions. This is the thing that we have to understand. Russia's tactics are always evolving and adapting. What we're fighting against 2 years ago of a sanctions pattern may have already shifted into other arenas, other areas, and that's why it is a constant moving target. It's a whack-a-mole. We have to be very forward-leaning. So even though we have a robust sanctions regime, I don't think we can think about that as being very sufficient. And then finally, there's a lot of concern about the Magnitsky Act being very, very concerning to them, and the Europeans are now increasingly adopting that legislation, which is adding additional concern. So we see some progress, but we also see some loopholes that are now being used to great effect.
Mr. Nunes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador McFaul, you're aware that lying to Congress is a crime, and you're expected to tell the whole truth here, correct?
Yes.
Just want to ask you a series of folks that you may or may not be familiar with, but I'm interested to know whether or not you've communicated with these folks. Ambassador Kislyak was the former Russian ambassador to the U.S. You communicated with Ambassador Kislyak?
Yes. When I worked at the White House, I met with him often.
How about Igor Sechin, who's the CEO of Rosneft?
Yes, I first met Igor Sechin in the spring of 1991 when he was a deputy for Vladimir Putin. I didn't have a lot of contact with him until I became the U.S. ambassador, but I met him probably 2 or 3 times as the U.S. ambassador.
Bill Browder?
Yes, I know Bill Browder. I've met with him many times.
What about Natalia Veselnitskaya?
No, I've never met Natalia Veselnitskaya, although I testified in June 2016, and she was sitting right there behind me. I have my computer up like this, and it looks like she was recording things I was doing, but I've never met her before personally.
All right, we'll count that as a no. Glenn Simpson from Fusion GPS.
I don't believe I've ever met him, no.
Anybody associated with Fusion GPS?
You'd have to tell me who's affiliated with him.
Nellie Orr?
No.
What about Bruce Orr?
No.
Jonathan Weiner, State Department?
I know of Jonathan Weiner because we were on the list together of the people that Putin wanted to arrest that they announced after Helsinki, but I don't think I've met him, sir.
Christopher Steele?
No.
Benjamin Wittes?
I know him, yes.
What about Michael Isikoff?
I know him. I've met him a few times. We're not colleagues.
Okay, I'm going to ask you, your name pops up in a lot of articles in 2016. Matter of fact, you're one of the first folks to talk about Carter Page. There's a June 17th, 2016 Washington Post article written by Tom Hamburger, where you and David Kramer are sourced in that article. Are you familiar with that article?
Sir, not off the top of my head, but I know that reporter, yes. And I know David Kramer. Used to work for the Bush administration, yeah.
How did you know that Carter Page was going to be in Moscow in July of 2016, speaking at a conference?
I read about it in the Russian press, sir. He spoke at the New Economic School. He was the speaker at their graduation ceremony.
And you were live tweeting during that conference? You had several tweets at that time about that conference. Were you watching it live?
I don't remember, sir, but whatever I said on Twitter would know what I was said. I did remember at the time, I found it ironic and somewhat strange that they would choose Carter Page to be their commencement address speaker. The last American to have that honor was Barack Obama in July 2009. And I probably commented, because I most certainly believe it to this day, that it was very odd to me that this rather obscure business person would be given such an honor.
There's another article I want to draw your attention to. It's rather famous, but it was written by Michael Isikoff from Yahoo News on September 23rd, 2016, and it was used to get a FISA warrant on Carter Page. Are you familiar with that article?
Not off the top of my head, sir.
Do you have any idea who the source for former U.S. government official, who the source would be?
No, not at all.
That gave information on Carter Page to Michael Isikoff?
I do not, sir.
Were you ever briefed on or given reports from Fusion GPS?
No, I just read about it in the press.
So the first time you ever saw the dossier was when?
When it was published by BuzzFeed, is that right? As I recall, that's when I saw it.
So you never saw the dossier before that?
No.
All right. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses today. So often, former military and intelligence officers are often part of the business elite, become part of the business elite. And I guess my question to you, Ambassador McFaul, is how common is it to find former Russian intelligence officers, serving as senior executives in Russian banks or in Russian companies abroad?
It's only become common under Vladimir Putin. So that was not the case during the earlier years, during the Yeltsin years, or even the Soviet times. But over the last 20 years, you have seen a very systematic replacement of CEOs of the top Russian government enterprises owned by the government, replaced with FSB officials and other military officials. And pretty much, I could go through the list. I brought the list if you're interested, but the vast majority of them, not all of them. So I mentioned Sberbank earlier. That's the largest Russian bank. That's run by a guy named German Gref, to the best of my knowledge, but Steve may know things I don't know. He is not a member of the Russian military intelligence. Shuvalov, who now runs VEB, is not, but the other big, large corporations, many of them are former intelligence officers, and I also want to underscore that's a bit of a paradoxical statement to say, former intelligence officers, because once in the KGB, they're always loyal to the KGB.
Are counterintelligence or current intelligence efforts to track Russian business, financial, or economic influence efforts in North America and in Europe adequate? Are our counterintelligence efforts to track sort of these Russian business alliances efficient?
So I've been out of the government for 5 years, so I don't know what is happening on the classified side. You might know better than I. I do want to say, as an academic who follows these things closely, I think it is grossly understudied. This is hard stuff to study, by the way. You have some of the best people in the world that do it. But we don't have good information on that. We're not tracing it. The ability to set up companies anonymously here and to buy property and to use law firms to transfer money, all of those things prevent researchers from doing that kind of work. And I would strongly encourage this committee to use the facilities and resources you have to do more of that work. Because one other thing I want to say, not all Russian business abroad is illegal or run by Putin. A lot of it is, but not all of it is. And I think we make a mistake if all of that, all the capital flight that Heather mentioned, a lot of that is money running away from Putin because they don't want it to be stolen from them. And I think having a firm accounting of that, and then how it is used, and how it is used as leverage, would be an excellent assignment that this committee should give somebody.
So, Mr. Hall, are there certain red flags that are indicators of operations hidden by the Kremlin as business alliances? Are there red flags that you can talk about? I know, and not compromise sources and methods, but.
Yeah, I would imagine that there probably are forensically some things that can be determined when you're looking at money laundering, when you're looking at illicit activities of that type of thing. But being a former CIA guy, I mean, I want spies, because it's much easier to have somebody on the inside telling you, here's what these guys are doing, as opposed to trying to figure it out from the outside. Both parts are obviously needed, and members of this committee are certainly better versed than I am in terms of what we're doing in collection on that. But it's definitely something that needs to be looked at.
How hard is it to recruit within Moscow, within Russia?
It's a challenge for a number of reasons, and I hesitate because I'm trying to figure out what I should say and what I shouldn't say in that regard. But let me just say that I think the Russia. When I worked at CIA, we had, and we probably still do, a group that we refer to as hard targets. This was Russia, China, Iran, the normal set of folks that you would probably expect. These are the hardest of the hard. These are the folks that are really, really difficult to recruit and get information out of.
What actors are probably the most vulnerable to intelligence operations, would you say?
In terms of recruitment operations? Yeah. It really, I'm not sure that it breaks down in terms of blocks, because it's all about human beings and what motivates them and what their vulnerabilities are. It just depends on the individuals.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Sewell. Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get to my questions, Mr. Chairman, Let I read into the record. I did so with a heavy heart and with thought and consideration. There's nothing more difficult that we do than trying to hold each other accountable. Our words, our actions have consequences, and so that's simply what we try to do. The litany. Well, let me say this. The emotional reaction you had is certainly expected, but let me be clear. A clear, convincing statement for the record. Nothing in our letter could be interpreted or remotely interpreted as causing you to be able to accuse us of thinking it's okay for that long litany of prepared remarks that you read into the record that you said you were not okay with, and then to imply with the technique that you're very good at, that somehow we do. We don't. Our letter has absolutely nothing to do with what President Trump, candidate Trump, campaigns, whatever they might have done. Our letter speaks to our concern that the intelligence agency that we seek to oversee, the important role, in fact, unique role that this committee has in that role in Congress is compromised by your continued leadership. And I don't say that lightly. You and I have had a good working professional relationship for over 2.5 years, and it doesn't please me in the least to say that. With that, would one of the panelists speak to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline? Is it, in fact, a pure commercial enterprise? Or, in your judgment, will Putin, at a point in time, use that pipeline to further leverage his mischief in Germany and in Europe?
Sir, I'm happy to take that question. In fact, we offer some thoughts on the financing structure of Nord Stream 2 and how European banks are being used to fund Russian projects.
Speaking of that, are those financing arrangements typically commercial-based, or are the interest rates higher than you would expect in this market?
Sir, I would not have the details on that. I think, again, for us, it's the transparency and the complexity of how these deals are structured that, in part, we need to have a better understanding. No, in my view, Nord Stream 2 is not strictly a private energy deal, and this has been brought to the attention of the German government. This increases Europe's dependency on Russian energy. We have to think of Nord Stream 2 in the same light as a pipeline called Turk Stream, which is bringing Russian gas through Turkey to increase Europe's dependency. And what we highlight in our report is that actually the energy sector, Russia uses that as such a powerful tool, not just for dependency, but it's the financing that it buys a lot of the downstream energy of other countries. It is such a powerful tool, and it is very important that Congress continues to emphasize that Nord Stream 2 is not in Europe's interest.
Any question of the four of you that Putin would not use that leverage if he felt it to be at his advantage? Anybody believe he would be an honest broker across that? In the time remaining,
just one footnote to what Heather already said. It increases dependence of our European allies. It also reduces the transit fees for Ukraine. So it's very deliberately aimed at weakening Ukraine.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that, and I agree. Can you speak to the Russian oligarchs' mischief in Armenia and, by extension, Putin, and the effect it's having on that nation's nascent attempts to regain its sovereignty and remove the Russian influence from it? Anybody speak to that?
I'm sorry to say I'm not as familiar with Armenia.
Armenia is a country in South Caucasus.
I'm aware. I'm just not. Thank you.
Maybe,
I'm just not aware of the Russian oligarch patterns.
I thought maybe my West Texas accent had screwed up the pronunciation of the name of the country.
You're perfectly clear, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony this morning. I concur that that Putin, we probably ought to just use Putin in lieu of the word Russia anyway, because everything runs through him that's of malign things that are going on. Thank you for your clear-eyed testimony this morning about the threats he poses to democracies around the world and in our national interest. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I yield to Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chairman Schiff. Mr. Hall, can you explain the relationship between the Russian organized crime apparatus and the oligarchs, and how do they even coexist?
Yeah, as I said in my statement, this is a question I get often, and my first response when I'm asked about Russian organized crime is always to remind people, to the extent possible, to take off those Western lenses. When we think of organized crime in the United States, we think of the mafia, we think of Al Capone, all that sort of thing. I believe that in Russia, those distinctions are either much less clear or practically non-existent. When you have little rule of law in a country like you do in Russia, it's extremely weak and I would argue in some places non-existent. So then, it's very difficult then to determine, who's an organized criminal and who's not. When you have Vladimir Putin, the head of the country, essentially approving murders outside of his own country, how does that not make him an organized criminal? So that said, we have in the West and intelligence services have gone to some extent to try to map those out. Who are the different key mob bosses, if you will. Again, for me, it's a little bit of an artificial construct because it's all sort of organized crime. The oligarchs play a key part of that. The way I look at this is, I think the simplest way to look at this is, again, like any of the guys, whether it's Kaspersky or any of the others, if you get a call from the Kremlin or if you get a call from any of Putin's guys saying, hey, I need this from you, whether or not it's building a stadium in Sochi or whether it's organizing some sort of business deal outside of Russia or something inside of Russia, an appropriate answer is not, yeah, I appreciate that, but no. The appropriate answer, if you want to keep your life in most cases, is yes, sir, how many bags? And 3 bags full, and here it comes. It's a little more complicated, it's a little more subtle, but I think in terms of discussing the relationships, that kind of encompasses how things work a lot in Russia.
So in addition to that, and in wrapping up, given the sprawl of Russian intelligence, are oligarchs or their businesses used oftentimes as cover or vectors for influence for intelligence operations?
Again, yes. I mean, that's certainly, and the reason I say yes is not because I have the top 5 in my mind, but again, if the FSB, who answers directly to Vladimir Putin and the others, calls you up and says, hey, you've got this business located in XYZ location, I need you to do the following things for me, it gets done. It's a unity of government approach that we probably all would love to, well, I guess we wouldn't love to have here in the United States, but it's certainly something that they can do.
Are any oligarchs even bold enough to challenge Putin philosophically?
That's a tough one. That's to ask, what goes on in those meetings in the dacha outside of Moscow when they all get together over the weekends. And, I argue that even if you were a fly on the wall, if you had some sort of, way to monitor what goes on in those meetings, I'm still not sure that we would understand because Vladimir Putin, being a former operative himself, I think is playing his oligarchs and his power people against each other to see what their reactions are going to be and what his best way forward is. I think it's all very complicated stuff. Mike's probably...
I should have asked the ambassador that question, but yeah.
So thinking off the top of my head of oligarchs, they like to be called business people, but let's call them oligarchs for now. No, I can't think of somebody that would stand up and confront Vladimir Putin today.
Not even a childhood friend?
Well, the childhood friends are a little bit different. There's a crony group. There are different categories, right? So there's the people he put in place of the state-owned enterprises. We talked about them. Then there are the oligarchs from the 1990s. And let's point out that that's a different group than his friends and cronies that now run these companies and some who have become billionaires only because of their relationship with Putin. Some of those people did challenge him. One was mentioned by Steve Hall earlier. His name is Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and he was arrested in 2003 and spent 10 years in jail as a result of challenging him politically. And once that happened, that, as you can imagine, that had a chilling effect on other oligarchs standing up to him. Of his circle, I think there are 2 people that are not oligarchs, but people I used to deal with and others have reported that do challenge his assumptions. One is German Gref, who I mentioned, the head of Sberbank. He has the kind of personal relationship with Mr. Putin that he can do that. He was one of the original reformers back in the early 2000s.
Did he serve in the KGB with Vladimir Putin?
To the best of my knowledge, I want to underscore, I don't know everything, but to the best of my knowledge, no. And the other one is Alexei Kudrin, his former finance minister, who's now works in a different place. Those are the only 2 individuals I know that have stood up to Putin in discussions of policy, not respect to property rights, but in discussions of economic policy.
Thank you both. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Carson. Mr. Turner.
When Senator Joe McCarthy walked the halls of Congress, people in this nation were transfixed, but they were also appalled. And this body then recognized the danger of unethical abuse of congressional powers. Now, the testimony from Steve Hall today says that he has Vladimir Putin as identified as his primary goal is the weakening of democracy in the United States and the West. Mr. Chairman, I'm asking for your resignation today because I believe you are advancing Putin's work. I believe the chair has abused his power in these processes, and he's misrepresenting the information that we've received in classified sessions. Now, Mr. Chairman, when this body understood that McCarthyism was something to be rejected, it for years watched it. But you are using that playbook. With McCarthyism, we had Russia chasing after Russian communists, and now we have Schiff chasing after Russian collusion and those who would collude. Mr. Chairman, in your opening statements, you attacked in true McCarthy fashion each and every one of this. You stated that you stated what we think. You can't say what we think. It's the lowest form of any argument to attack someone. Now, what we have said is we've come forward and said that we all think that your leadership of this committee is compromised, in part because you behave as if your fellow members of this committee are your enemy. You behave as if the president is also similarly your enemy, and in true McCarthy fashion, you act as though you are the only one who is capable of protecting this nation, and everyone else is a co-conspirator who have suspected intentions. Your response could have been that you're here to protect national security, that you're here to ensure this committee has no leaks, that you're here to ensure that this committee works together, and that you want to have a true bipartisan work to support the international intelligence efforts of our country. Instead, you've shown contempt for your fellow members of Congress. For 2 years, your opening statements have repeatedly attacked the members of this committee, their motives, and their work. You have transformed the staff of this committee so that they are prosecutorial instead of working on issues of national security and intelligence. You have misrepresented to the American people information that we received in classified sessions. And you've had this committee diverge from its goals. That is a danger to our national security. It is a distraction. It causes this committee not to function. When this Congress took a look back at itself and what had happened with Senator Joe McCarthy, it made a commitment that Congress would no longer be abusive in its powers, that it would look to protecting its national security. And Mr. Chairman, your reactions today were in true McCarthyism as you chose to attack us instead of state your commitment to national security. Ms. Conley, did Joe McCarthy advance Russia's communistic goals of separating our country? Did McCarthyism advance democracy, or did it hinder democracy? Did McCarthyism shackle us with a burden of divisiveness rather than cohesiveness in trying to move forward as we look to our adversaries?
Congressman, I'm not the best placed witness to answer your question.
Pastor McFaul?
I'm also not an expert on McCarthyism. I'm an expert
I just
on
want
other
your personal opinion.
I do think polarization in our society advances Putin's national interest, as defined by him.
I greatly appreciate you answering that question. Now, my question goes to Montenegro. Ms. Conley, you know I've worked on NATO and NATO issues, and I'm very proud of the fact that our nation supported Montenegro joining, and I think that certainly sets aside some of the advancement of Russia and Russia's interests. When I was in Montenegro, they had billboards up chastising the dangers of NATO and trying to affect that electorate. Could you please tell us of the effect of our work with NATO and Montenegro and how it sets aside Russia's advance?
Congressman, thank you. Russian influence in Montenegro is substantial. In fact, it's one of the case study countries we note. The economic influence particularly concentrated on real estate and tourism. And you're absolutely seeing some of the byproducts of where that great investment is. They can finance billboards and political parties to work against the Euro-Atlantic drive of these countries. I can't begin to tell you how vital it is for NATO to continue to give these countries hope and support alongside of our European allies, that there is a different way. But what I would highlight for you is two things. One of the greatest weapons within Montenegro for Russian influence is the Serbian Orthodox Church. This continues to play an outsized role in shaping Montenegrins' views of themselves and where their future lies. Secondly, I would argue the lesson that I learned, and I was Deputy Assistant Secretary, the State Department, when we enlarged NATO in 2004 for our Central and European allies, and we made a fatal mistake. We believe our work is finished when these countries enter NATO or the European Union. It is absolutely the opposite. The work begins. We have to redouble our efforts to make sure that Montenegro remains secure in the Euro-Atlantic community. The fact that Russian GRU members hatched a coup attempt in October of 2016 to prevent Montenegro from joining NATO tells you the steps that the Kremlin will take to stop the forward march of these countries joining the West. So, sir, your leadership on that was very important. All of Congress's leadership is important as the Senate embraces ratifying an amended NATO treaty to welcome the Republic of North Macedonia, another dramatic attempt that Russia tried to prevent. Thank you.
Mr. Quigley.
Mr. Chairman, interesting aspects of our chairman. I mean, any chairman who would conduct a midnight ride, prepare a memo, which was called dangerously reckless, use sensitive law enforcement information without any evidence to support any of its conspiracy theories, who would tank an investigation, shut down an investigation, go along with a White House gag order, attack the FBI and the intel community, inhibit their ability to complete their work. Extraordinary. Mike Morrell said what the Russians did was the political equivalent of 9/11. I fear that what the administration has done, and this former chairman, not the current chairman, has done, will have far greater and more profound impact on our country, on the ability of the intelligence community and the Justice Department to do its job. So it's simple to say and talk about these things, but it was just last March in which Chairman Nunes said he had uncovered evidence that the intel community, we would assume the FBI and NSA, had improperly monitored and unmasked Trump transition teams. And he rushed off to the White House to tell them all about this. It was just one of many string of activities to undermine what we were attempting to do to find the truth. So given that, we'll go on to the questions at hand. Mr. Hall, can you dive a little deeper in how the Kremlin and the GRU, among others, use the money laundering efforts to complete their intelligence activities?
I think the best way to look at it is that when the GRU, or really any of the Russian intelligence services, has a requirement for financing, whether it's an operational requirement for people to travel from point A to point B, or whether they want to use or try to develop compromising information, business or financial otherwise, they have the means to do that, not only internal to the GRU, but also because the order for doing something like that would probably come from more senior outside the GRU. Again, this is sort of like a mob type of situation that we're thinking about. Resources inside of Russia that the GRU can access are essentially limitless. When the boss says, you know, we need financial information on this particular individual or that Western businessman, then it gets done. And if the GRU is the one who's chosen to do it by the Kremlin, then off they go and the resources are there. There is no oversight process there. There's no budgeting process. There is, but it's primarily paperwork. So they really have all the resources that they need to go after whatever target the Kremlin decides they need to go after.
Mr. Quigley, there are only 2 minutes left on the vote. Let's recess here, and we will return right after votes, and we'll pick up with Mr. Quigley. Thank you. We are in recess.
Okay. So, best place to reach you at your Stanford, yeah. I'll give you. Okay.
Hey, how you doing?
Okay, very briefly, please get these guys first. Sure, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
you got your finger over the thing here? You don't have to now. Yeah. Where's that thing on your head? Put that thing on your head. Now see, right now, if I were you, you'll think I'm being a you know what. See, you could be sitting there, you could send out things via email. Literally just press a button. You're making money right now. And that's what I mean. Right? Right. Well, come on now. You got like a tornado, a tsunami. But there's, as a practical matter, but as a practical matter, you do got to get some things settled in the system. Because you'll be starting and stopping. Although that in and of itself is not a bad thing, because maybe if you just work around it, you can still get some things done. Yeah, but the only problem is, I agree with you. The only problem is it would have to be consistent for it to have any meaning, because you have the trick is. Did you use the P word? Yeah. How come I can just see the top of you? Okay, fine. I'm going to do the same thing. Literally, look behind you. I got to double up on the back one now. Lower back. Oh, how it work out? Yeah. And strength. No. I'm just simply saying that's what's there, and then that's what's inside the cat. Really? So you're the right cat. Who's that? Who's that? I didn't get it. I got it. Who is that? I was watching a movie with my phone, and I worked down and just like 11 birds. The bird? I know. You watching the bird in the phone? Yeah. Yeah. I have an iPad that I really I have a really old one, so I've heard the wisdom of this a lot of times. Oh, at school? I'm still not done with work yet. I got you. I got you. Got you. Those guys hate each other, man. Those guys started hating each other when they sobered up. Well, do some lessons. What's amazing to me is I didn't do it, Sky. Yeah, I didn't do it. Who are you talking about? Oh, yeah. Even I don't know. Yuki was there. And then you had, the one in the background. Called her the old man. She smacked me the other day so hard. Nick got his worst. He had to get hip replacement. He had to get that hip replacement. He had to get all that surgery done because his back was rotting out. then I got coming at noon, so I'll do that. And then, yeah, I got it right here. To go. Look at that business. And we got emails now. tmash@opportunityzonesamerica.com. All the emails are there. So everything comes from the official account. And I created the signature block, put the logo in it, and James. He's executive vice president, and he runs my St. Louis office. You never know. He might be clean. What's that? He might be clean. You never know. When people say looking like that, I'd be out of it. Looking like that?
Not the ones that are.
I do recognize you put forth effort. That's not on my notes. Yep, you put forth effort. No, I was going to Anyway, what were you saying about cut it out, like ceremony.
Committee will come to order. Mr. Quigley, you are recognized.
Thank you. To our panel, where do the Russians launder money and who are their dance partners?
Sir, I'll take that question. The Russians launder money, short answer, all over, but certainly throughout Eastern and Western Europe, through major financial institutions and in major financial capitals, and potentially here in the United States as well.
And to your knowledge, do we have any idea where here in the United States and who they might be working with? Obviously, we are aware of Deutsche Bank being fined money for laundering money.
So not to my knowledge where specifically, but that gets to sort of the primary issue is that both in the United States and in Europe, as one of my co-witnesses has made clear, there are limits to how much information we can obtain regarding beneficial ownership information about the true identity of individuals behind companies, and that obscures both our ability within law enforcement and intelligence, but also private sector financial institutions' efforts and ability to really dig deep and figure out who these individuals behind these companies are and where they're located.
So they're laundering to escape sanctions principally, and taxes, we assume?
I think it's a whole range of financial crimes. To Mr. Hall's point from earlier, it's not just sanctions evasion. It's laundering for tax evasion. It's laundering for other types of illicit finance, for human trafficking, kind of across the board.
Yes, sir.
Just if I could add to that, Cyprus, of course, is one of the countries that Russia uses for money laundering. But the UK and the United States are probably close to the top of the list as well because of the things that my colleagues have talked about. I just wanted to underscore it. Anonymous companies, we allow that here, and that's a vehicle for laundering money. Purchase of property can be done without transparency. That's another way. And then because of client privilege relations, law firms are also one of the vehicles. So as a recommendation, I just want to underscore something Heather said earlier, actually Eric as well. Very concretely, if you want to fight what the oligarchs do abroad, more transparency is the right thing, is a very important part of that. The second thing I want to emphasize, however, is that not all of the money coming out of Russia is controlled by Putin. I think that's really important for people to understand. A lot of it is money that is afraid of Putin. They don't want their money to be stolen. They don't want their money to be confiscated by the Kremlin, and so they are also part of the group that are moving their money from Russia to places in the West.
Thank you. My time is more than expired.
Thank you, Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. One thing I do want to say from the outset is somebody who's in his first elected office, not my first term, but my first elected office. I'm a doctor, I'm a surgeon. It was not illegal for me to continue seeing patients and operating on them while I was a candidate. But things changed once I became a candidate and there were different rules. I became a member of Congress and there were different rules. Just want to say that for the record. And Ambassador McFaul, I appreciate you talking about the, I call it the instruments of Putinism, if you will. I think that it's what we do need to address. And I want to talk about that in a minute. But I also, we've had morality defined to us today. And frankly, I consider entrapment to be immoral, especially if it's being done by Russians. I think it's immoral for a campaign or a party to which many of our members here have donated to pay a British agent and Russians. Let me point that out. Russians were involved with the dossier to create an unverified, salacious document against the opposing candidate. Okay? Now, I doubt that Putin was unaware that Russians took part in that. That's well documented. But I'm surprised to see the legs that took. Putin probably never imagined, or maybe he did, that the FBI, the DOJ, possibly the CIA, would focus on the American candidate and their campaign rather than the Russian involvement with this entire thing. To the point of surveillance of the campaign, running people into the campaign, and in my opinion, to try and entrap innocent people from that campaign. We even saw an attempted entrapment on the chairman by some comedians. But with all of this, I'm sure that Mr. Putin looks on with glee as we now have a nation so divided, polarized, as was said here today. It's beyond my belief. And they've gotten away with it. I said in this committee 2 years ago, as the fighting began, which was not there my first term on this committee, by the way, until Mr. Trump won. As the fighting began, I said the Russians are getting everything they want right now. And we have not had discussions of FISA abuses this term. We've not had discussions on the unmasking processes that take place, all of which have raised serious concerns about what is taking place here. We also haven't had discussions on Russian involvement with the dossier. And I don't know how we get back together as a nation and how we become unpolarized, if we will, if we don't address the truth and have true justice and America know what actually took place. So I'm disappointed, as you might imagine, to see all this focus and none on the Russians themselves as they were involved with that entire process from the beginning as having helped to write that dossier. And if Putin was for Trump, what has happened to the Russians that tried to take him down? You've been very eloquent about the power of this man. So I would like to hear anybody would like to comment on the Russian involvement with this whole process from the beginning as being involved with the dossier.
I mean, I could try to speak to that. You're referring to the Steele dossier. I am not aware of, and again, I've been out of service for a number of years now, but I'm not aware of direct Russian involvement in the dossier. I don't rule it out. I'm simply not aware of it.
Well, that's how it's been reported, but we haven't seen anything coming from within ourselves to say yes or no. We're investigating it. Yet that's what's been reported. And let me tell you, we've gone down a lot of paths because of things that were reported that weren't necessarily true. But shouldn't we be trying to look into that? Let me just have your opinion. Does that not, if that's true, doesn't it disturb you?
I think it's absolutely important.
Mr. McFaul, you're shaking your head yes, so I'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely, sir. I have a lot of questions about what the Russians did in 2016 that haven't been answered. That's why I want to read Mr. Mueller's report. I used to work with him. He's a thorough guy. I look forward to reading that. I think we have to know what happened. We have to do the diagnostics properly. And just let me say two things, because you asked for my opinion, so that's why I woke up, okay? I'm not an expert on what happened, but two things I feel really strongly about. National security is not a partisan issue. I worked for the National Security Council. I didn't work for the Democratic Security Council. And I took an oath of office to the United States of America when I became the U.S. ambassador. And there are other issues that are done in partisan ways, right? Tax policy benefits some and others, and we can debate about that. You all debate about that. But when it comes to national security, if the Russians attack us, they're not going to just attack the Republicans and leave the Democrats to the side. They're not going to do that. And I hope, I'm sorry to get emotional, but I want us to get back to the national security threats that threaten all of us together.
Thank you. I appreciate that. When I joined the military under a president I didn't vote for, because I put that first. That was my commander-in-chief. I took an oath to defend the United States of America. I couldn't agree with you more, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you.
Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you, Chairman. And Chairman, I support you holding this hearing and the work you've done to address the threats from the outside as well as from the inside. And first, I just want to ask, yes or no, is it the judgment of each witness that Russia intends to attack and interfere in our democracy again this upcoming 2020 election? Ms. Conley.
They will not stop. They will continue.
Ambassador McFaul.
I don't know. I know they have the capacity to do everything they did in 2016, And we as a country on multiple planes, and I'm happy to walk through all of them if we have time, have done next to nothing to protect ourselves. That doesn't mean that they'll use that capacity. I think it'll depend on the situation in 2020. But will they look at the United States? Will Putin look at the United States as his principal enemy in the world and do things to reduce our capacity to do things in the world? The answer to that is yes.
Thank you. Mr. Hall.
Yes, I believe they will.
And Mr. Lorber.
I don't know, but if past is prologue, as evidenced in the 2016 and the 2018 elections, I have serious concerns that they will try.
Thank you. Ms. Conley, what is the objective of sanctions against Russia?
The objective is to change Russia's behavior and its violations of international law, whether that's the illegal annexation of Crimea, the seizure of territory in eastern Ukraine. It's to punish them for the use of chemical weapons on NATO territory. It is to change behavior. Unfortunately, we've not seen a change of behavior. If anything, we've seen a doubling down of aggressive behavior.
Ambassador McFaul, have the various sanctions affected the Russia economy over the years?
Yes. There are different estimates. I go through different estimates in my written testimony. One estimate is 1.5% of GDP was lost in 2014. Another one by the World Bank puts it more at 2.5%. Bloomberg Economics put it at 6% since 2014. And that's on the aggregate, Congressman. Remember, on the individuals, they also have an effect. Putin himself has said on the record that it violates the human rights of some of those individuals. These are his close personal friends, so they definitely are having an impact. And I want to add two things, if I may, to what Heather already said. The goal for us, of course, is to change Putin's behavior. That is what sanctions are put in place for. But there's another thing I think that's important. Sometimes you just have to do the right thing, even if you know you're not going to change that behavior. So think of the counterfactual. Russia annexes territory in Crimea, and we do nothing. That will then create, I think, permissive conditions for him to do more. So remember that, even if you're not seeing change in behavior. Also remember, Putin very rationally wants to lift sanctions. If I were the president of Russia, I would want to lift sanctions on my close friends and to reduce that burden on the Russian economy. There's nothing spectacular about that.
Are they worthy of having sanctions lifted?
Am I worried?
Are they worthy?
Oh, no, no. But what I wanted to say is, rather than changing his behavior, he's waiting for governments to change. That's a very different strategy, right? In Europe and here in the United States, that's what he's been waiting for. And in my opinion, that would be a cataclysmic mistake to lift sanctions just in the name of getting along with Putin. You can't do that until he's changed his behavior.
I've long thought, or I first thought after the interference campaign, that the reason that the Russians sought to help Donald Trump, as our Intelligence Committee assessed, was that transactionally they wanted to get a benefit. They wanted to see the reduction of NATO's influence, a candidate who talked about doing that. They wanted a candidate who would reduce sanctions. They wanted a candidate who would look the other way on what they've done in Crimea. But the more I've learned through many of you and others on Russia's intentions is that what they really sought to do was to tear down the idea of America, this idea that no matter who you are, where you're from, what your parents did, who you love, that if you work hard enough, you can be anything. And if that's true in our young country, it could be true anywhere, including in Russia. And the best way to keep Russians from asking for that fair shot, that democracy, free markets, free ideas, a freedom to dream, is to destroy it at its origin, and that was the bigger goal that they had. Would you agree with that, Ambassador?
I think both can be true. So most certainly the second piece, and that is part of their focus, and that's been the focus of Putin well before the 2016 election. He's just using new means to get at that, at what you described. The second is also true. You don't need to believe me. Vladimir Putin said it at the Helsinki summit, at the press conference. He said, I wanted Trump to win. And by the way, that's very rational if you're Putin because of what candidate Trump said. Now, I want to give the Trump administration credit that all those things that they thought they were going to get, they didn't get. But the second category, I think they feel pretty good that they're receiving returns on their investment in the second category you described.
And I only point that out because we've now learned about Russian investments in the NRA, and when you step back and think about it, they don't have gun rights in Russia, so it's not like they're advancing some principle they believe in at home, but it's to really stoke a culture war, again, tearing down the idea of America. And I'll yield back.
Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses, thank you all. I'm familiar with not all of you, but several of you I am in your long years of service, and I thank you for that service and for being here today. And I do have a list of questions for you, which I'll get to in a moment. But before I do, I feel like I have to address at least briefly the elephant in the room, and to, as a kind of man-to-man, explain to our chairman why I signed this letter today. I consider myself a fairly soft-spoken person. I don't like conflict. I don't seek after conflict. But again, I think that this deserves an explanation, and that is that the chairman of the Select Intelligence Committee is not just another politician. It's not just someone who is a member of the resistance and may disagree with this president. This individual is in a position of great responsibility and special trust. And that trust can be destroyed if accusations are made without evidence. Last weekend, the Attorney General and Mr. Mueller released their report and a synopsis of those reports. Now, this is important to make, that some have said that he concluded there wasn't sufficient legal threshold was reached to prove conspiracy or collusion, but that's simply not true. He didn't say we saw evidence, but it wasn't sufficient to reach a legal threshold to prosecute. He said we saw no evidence of collusion. And he even added, despite multiple attempts by the Russians to make contact with the campaign, the House Intelligence Committee found this, the Senate Intelligence Committee has indicated they have found no evidence of collusion. Mr. Mueller found evidence or no evidence of collusion. And yet, just a few days ago, Chairman, you said, undoubtedly there is collusion. And I think it's important to note that I would substitute collusion with treason. Because you're not accusing someone of getting a parking ticket or stealing a piece of bubblegum. You are accusing the president of treason, of working with a foreign government and not an ally, not an unknown government entity, a long-time known adversary, and you are saying he has committed high crimes. He is subverting our own law. He is trying to steal an election. He is destroying the trust of the electoral process and break down faith in democracy. And I don't think you can make that accusation and at the same time say, but we're not going to call for his impeachment. I don't think you can have it both ways. If you truly believe that, I don't know how you could not rise today and say, and he should be impeached, and I will lead efforts to impeach him. Because you can't say that he has committed treason and say, but we're okay with that. To use your phrase, Mr. Chairman, we're okay with that. We'll allow him to stay in office. It has to be one or the other. And that's why I signed this letter today. Now, to the witnesses, I'd like to ask you a series of questions, if I could, in the few minutes I have left, and just answer yes or no. I think they really are yes or no questions. Do you think that the president's efforts to pressure NATO to comply with their long-held commitments of spending 2% of their GDP on military and on readiness? I was a former Air Force pilot. I remember flying with NATO pilots. Loved those guys. They wanted to be in the fight, but they didn't have the capabilities that we needed them to have because their politicians and policymakers had not committed to spending the money that they said they would. Do you think that pressuring NATO to fulfill that commitment is an important tool to countering Russia's influence in Europe? Ms. Conley?
Congressman, pressing our European allies to spend more on defense has been the policy of the United States government for well over 40 decades, and we must continue it. But we cannot use this pressure to break the alliance. And what the president has done is used an important tool to get them to spend more and now created a real division in the alliance and the fact that many of our allies are not entirely sure America is faithful in its credibility in that alliance. So the objective is right. The tactics, however, are defeating the
I completely disagree with you. I don't think that it was the president's intention at all to weaken the alliance. We are simply asking them to do what they've committed to do. And they'll either do that or they won't. If they won't, then they're not a true member of the alliance. And I think that's a fair thing for him to do. Does anyone disagree that committing and pressuring NATO to increase their defense spending helps to counter Russian influence? None of you disagree with that, surely. Let me give another couple examples in a few seconds. Kinetic weapons to the Ukraine. The European Reassurance Initiative, something I think is incredibly important, pressuring our European allies not to rely on Russia for their energy needs. In fact, domestic energy policy that provides an increased world supply and drives down the price of global energy. I think every one of those are important policy decisions which helped to counter Russia's influence globally and in Europe. Do any of you disagree with that? Okay, thank you. And
Can I address that?
yes.
I think
well, my time is up. It's up to the chairman if he'll allow, but.
Yes, you may respond.
I think that everything that we've just talked about with regard to NATO and NATO members paying and so forth, interpreted in this room and in a Western context, is completely understandable, and as Heather indicated, has been policy. The Russians don't see it that way. Vladimir Putin sees that as a split. He sees that as weakening the NATO alliance and weakening our Western.
Well, then he's simply mistaken. He can
may be,
interpret
but that's
however
what
he wants.
he may be,
he's
but that's
mistaken
what
if that's how
ISS
he views
believes.
it. Yeah, thank you.
Before I recognize Mr. Heck, I do want to comment on something you said, Mr. Stewart, because I think it fundamentally misconceives what the Mueller report is and indeed what the Barr summary is. The Barr summary, which is all we have right now, doesn't say they found no evidence of collusion. That's simply not true. And that is repeated over and over again, so people think that's true, but that's not what the Barr letter says. What the Barr letter says is that Mueller could not establish a criminal conspiracy. That's something you would have to establish beyond a reasonable doubt. It doesn't mean there's not evidence. There is. And that's the fundamental difference here. And as I've said, Mr. Stewart, time and time again, and you can look in the public record because I've said this as a mantra dozens of times over the last year, that I think that these interactions with the Russians that I enumerated earlier are evidence of corruption. They're evidence of collusion, rather. But that whether that amounts to proof beyond a reasonable doubt of a crime, the crime of conspiracy, I've always said is a different question that Bob Mueller would have to decide. And he's decided that question. And I respect it. And I said that I would respect his judgment. But that's what I've said. And I think that the letter fundamentally misconceives that. Mr. Heck.
Well, would the chairman allow me to respond?
Yes.
And I'll do so just quickly. We're going to have to agree to disagree on the verbiage. And I think you're making a distinction without a difference in the sense that you have never, and to my knowledge, added that caveat. You have said, I see evidence of collusion. You didn't add that would reach a legal threshold. And we can find evidence of all sorts of things, but if it doesn't reach a legal threshold, then it's meaningless. And again, Mr. Chairman, we could have this conversation, but we'll agree to disagree, and I'll concede my time. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, may I just briefly be recognized for a procedural point? May I
Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May I enter into the record a PolitiFact finding from PolitiFact that you indeed did every time that you brought up the question of collusion, characterize it as a difference between a proof beyond a reasonable doubt finding by a prosecutor, but that there was evidence, and that's a March 25, 2019 PolitiFact story, What Democrats Said About Trump, Collusion Before Mueller Report. I'd like to enter that into the record.
And for clarification, would you share part of what it says?
Mr. Chairman, point of order, are we introducing PolitiFact information into this testimony hearing?
Yes, Mr. Crawford, I am.
Without objection.
I object to that.
Mr. Swalwell, you may be recognized.
Thank you. The article says Republicans have been having a field day rubbing the Democrats' noses in the outcome of Special Counsel Mueller's report. As the summary from the Attorney General William Barr quoted Mueller's report, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. It goes on to characterize your statements, Mr. Chairman. It says, as the top Democrat and current chair of HPSC, Adam Schiff has been a point man for the Democrats throughout the investigation. And it quotes you as saying a number of times, including about a year after January 10, 2018, you said, there's clear evidence of the issue of collusion. But whether it amounts to conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt, I think we will still have to wait for Bob Mueller's work. Schiff tweeted similar comments after Barr's letter was released March 24. Schiff wrote, Mueller did not find sufficient evidence to establish conspiracy, notwithstanding Russian offers to help the Trump campaign, their acceptance, and a litany of concealed interactions with Russia. I trust Mueller's prosecutorial judgment, but the country must see the evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Swalwell. I've just mentioned you could find literally dozens of times where I made the same observations over the last year and a half. Mr. Heck, you're recognized.
And I'd ask to put that into the record.
It will be made a part of the record. Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to be added to the list of those who also want to actually see Director Mueller's work product. I've, consistent with what the chair has asserted over the last year and a half, placed a great deal of confidence in him, and there's nothing about that confidence that's been changed or amended in any way by the developments of the last week. I'm more than bothered by the fact that there seems to be a subtle but nonetheless real campaign to foot drag on the release of this material. My mother always taught me consider the source, and so when it does come to the 4-page letter from the appointed Attorney General, who last summer submitted a 19-page single-space unsolicited argument that there was no basis for proceeding with obstruction of justice angle, for example, I do want to read the Mueller report. And I want to consider as well that which we seem to forget, because this is a evolving set of periodic amnesia, it seems to me. The original assertion for quite some time by the administration was there's no interference whatsoever in the election. None. And then when the weight of the unanimous opinion of the intelligence community came to full effect, then it was, well, yeah, there may have been interference, but they didn't really favor either candidate. And then that fell by the wayside. And then it was no collusion. And of course, we are where we are on the definition of these terms. Earlier today, there were repeated references to McCarthy hearings and Joseph McCarthy. I don't know, maybe it's because I sit next to my good friend from Vermont that I'm reminded of the other Joseph Welch, who famously said, "At long last have you left no sense of decency." Asked and answered. Ms. Conley, so grateful to you for your reference earlier about the importance of Congress continuing to emphasize that Nord Stream 2 is not in Europe's best long-term interest. Thank you for getting that characterization on the record. I would appreciate it, however, if you were comfortable associating some qualitative measure of that. We have a lot of risk that we have to assess that confront our NATO allies and confront us directly or indirectly. How serious of a threat to Europe's long-term interest and ours is the completion of Nord Stream 2, in your opinion?
Congressman, it's quite serious, but I would add it's also equally as serious as a pipeline called Turk Stream that will increase dependency of Southern Europe on Russian gas. We have to see this in the totality. I believe we should do everything in our power to convince our European partners that this is not in their interest. We are in a very fragile moment with our alliances. Alliances are America's greatest strength. And our adversaries know that, and that's why, in fact, Vladimir Putin's trying to break those alliances, because that is our strength. We have to work this very difficult issue, but maintain alliance unity. And that's been very difficult to do for previous administrations as well as for this administration. But it's very important that Europe breaks the dependency on Russian energy. There's EU law that provides for that, but they have to follow that law. We have to keep working very hard to prevent this from happening.
Do the Russians financially incentivize the Germans to play along? You or Ambassador?
Well, I would just say what we're seeing again across Europe are deep, deep economic relationships that have been there for decades. These are difficult relationships to break. These economic relationships have great political support and patronage across the political spectrum in these countries. It is very difficult.
Do the Russians financially incentivize the Germans?
Well, of course they do. This is
and
part
individuals?
Well, banks, and there are very notable individuals like former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder that is a part of this, and we see this repeating itself in other countries as well.
Have the sanctions on Gazprom had any effect in this regard?
In terms of causing specific transactional pain to Gazprom, the answer is likely yes. I don't have the figures directly in front of me.
Sufficient to deter the completion of Nord Stream 2?
At the current time, I don't think so, no.
I see I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Heck. Mr. Crawford.
Mr. Chairman, before I'm recognized, I have a parliamentary inquiry. I believe a gentleman from California asked unanimous consent to enter that into the record, and by definition, that would require unanimity. I objected, and yet you ignored that objection.
Mr. Crawford, would you like to take a vote on entering a PolitiFact record into the record? We made an objection to the partisan letter from you and your colleagues entering in the record.
All right, okay, well, that's fine. I have a list of quotes here I would like to submit for the record. I can read them all, or I can just submit it for the record if you'd like.
You're more than welcome to submit them for the record.
I'll submit those for the record, and now I'll claim my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, 1990 was the first McDonald's franchise was opened in Moscow, and you spent a lot of time there in Moscow as an ambassador.
I ate at that McDonald's in 1990 many times.
And there have been, I'm sure, several opened since then in that area. In 2007, Starbucks opened their first store. Starbucks is not a franchise, it's company-owned. So I raise that point to just illustrate the difference between franchise and a company-owned store. So certainly there's some different considerations there, wouldn't you agree?
I'm not an expert on these companies, but that's true, and I would remind you that the McDonald's that opened in 1990, if my memory serves me right, I want to be careful, that I think it was a Canadian enterprise, not an American one.
Okay. Have there been any American franchises opened up other brands since that 1990 timeframe that you're aware of?
Sir, because Congressman Nunes reminded me, I'm on the record, I want to be careful. I do not know. I did not do that research before coming here. My guess would be absolutely yes. There's several hundred of them.
You know, the world's just gotten so much smaller, and there's business, American-owned businesses all over the globe, and whether they're franchised, whether they're company-owned. So in 2007, Starbucks goes into Moscow, and I'm sure there's been several Starbucks locations since then. And now we have a presidential candidate, Howard Schultz. Do you think he should come under the same scrutiny? Do you think there's any potential collusion there? Do you think he might be compromised because he's done business there and opening up Starbucks stores in Russia?
Sir, I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's a great question. What I would say is, because I don't know what the business transactions were to open those Starbucks. I want to be clear about that.
Well, a little
I know
bit ago,
generally that it is difficult. I know generally that there's sometimes compromising things that have to happen, but I don't know that with the specific case of Starbucks. The second thing I would say is we should just call for transparency about that. And so you actually know that those Starbucks are there. And I think for all presidential candidates, we should know of all their business relations abroad. I think that's in the America's national interest.
Okay. So, I hope that comes to light. I certainly wouldn't want to see a presidential candidate that's not thoroughly vetted with regard to international business, given the context of what we've seen over the last couple of years. Right?
I couldn't agree more. And one of the ways to know that is to have people publish their taxes. That's how we know that.
We're not going to settle that in this committee.
I understand, but that's a really great way to have transparency about what you do financially abroad.
Okay, and something else you mentioned in your opening comments, you mentioned that the Russians influenced the 2016 election. That's an assessment I'm not sure you can make. I'm sure they attempted to influence, but that is entirely subjective, the degree to which they were influencing American voters. Isn't that fair to say?
Here's the way I would characterize it, and there's been many great academic studies. I cite many of them in the footnotes in my written testimony about this. Here's my personal assessment of that academic research, okay? Number one, just to remind everybody, there was a multi-pronged effort by the Kremlin to influence the outcome of our 2016 presidential election. Not just one thing, but many, many things that happened. Number two, they had clear preferences in that race. When Sputnik International tweets #Crooked Hillary, it's pretty, you don't need a PhD in Russian studies to figure out what they're trying to do there. And number three, now I want to put my political science hat on, which I've spent most of my life as a political scientist and not as a government official. I don't think one can isolate the independent causal influence of the Russian factor set against all the other factors that influence votes in the 2016 presidential election. So I'm not prepared to say that, unlike other people who have said that.
Let me pause just in the brief time I have left. It's been probably less than 2 years ago, former CIA Director Brennan said before this committee that the Russians had been engaged in active measures to seek to influence elections in the United States for decades. Do you agree with that?
Yes and no. I think what happened in 2016 was qualitatively different than any action of influence that
But is that attributable to the media they have available, or is it attributable to something else? Because we didn't have Twitter and Facebook back in the 1990s.
That's right. So that's different. We did have it in 2012. They didn't use it then. But without question, for me and my assessment, and this is my assessment, I want to emphasize, the most important thing they did was not that. It was the doxing. It was the stealing of American property from individuals and then publishing that. That's something that they had capabilities to do before and chose not to do it. So I think it is true this has always been their way. And by the way, I want to emphasize, it's not just the United States of America that is a target of these operations. It's all in other places. Watch what happens in Ukraine shortly. But I think 2016 was a qualitatively different operation than previous elections.
Thank you. My time's expired. I appreciate the amplification on the fact that they've been involved in other countries besides the United States. Thank you.
Mr. Welch.
Thank you very much. This is a really extraordinary panel, and I'm struck with the clarity and the consensus among the four of you about the threat that Russia poses. Mr. McCaul, or Ambassador McCaul, your opening statement was chilling in a way. The contest is now between, as you quote you, autocracy, corruption, state domination of the economy, and indifference to international norms versus democracy, rule of law, free markets, and respect for international law. And I take it there's a consensus among you about that characterization. And Professor Conley, what you also said, I thought was very, very powerful about this is about a strategy of influence, not force, and it exploits any societal weaknesses in divisions that we have, and they can get in your head. And Ambassador, what you were just describing, which is qualitatively different, is what is chilling to me. And I'll say this, as a member of Congress, until I was on and watched this, I was not as aware of the depth and aggression that has been behind this until I am now becoming a student of it. And I say that because I think that suggests that everyday citizens who are trying to figure out how to get through their day, get their kids to daycare, this is not forefront on their mind. So aside from this question that is the political debate that we're having, is it essential for our security that we have a consensus in the American body politic about what a dangerous adversary and determined adversary Russia is to our democratic values? I'll start with you, Ambassador.
The answer to that is yes. And let me say a couple of things, if I may. Number one, it was raised earlier, I think somebody was quoting Mike Morrell, that this was the political equivalent of September 11th. I believe that's the right way to frame it. It was a violation of our sovereignty in 2016. But unlike 9/11, we didn't have a bipartisan commission that investigated what happened. By the way, investigated what the Bush administration did. I'm a former member of the Obama administration. I think that should have been interrogated too. We didn't do that, and we haven't even got to the prescriptive part. So I would just, one, associate with that. I think that's the right frame. Number two, Putin's a person I have known. I met him first in 1991. I've written about him a lot. We're not exactly Facebook friends. He doesn't like me. I don't like him. But what I would note, as somebody who has watched his career, maybe not quite as long as Steve, but probably close, a couple of things. One, he's aggrieved. He thinks that we have ruined his country. But two, with time, he's gotten way more aggressive. He's taking bigger risks. So annexation, 2014, intervening in Syria, 2015, intervening in our elections in 2016, trying to kill Skripal in 2018, and trying to arrest Americans. Remember, that's what happened in Helsinki. Those are riskier actions, and I just want to make sure we understand the nature of this threat. It's growing, and it's become more belligerent.
That would suggest that there has to be, whatever our divisions are in our debates here, there has to be some unity coming from our State Department, from our executive branch, from our Congress, that whatever our divisions are, this is a threat to all of us. Would you speak to that?
Yes,
and you talked about corruption and how that undercuts democracy.
Well,
Please elaborate.
and thank you for your question. I do a lot of speaking to groups across the country, world affairs, councils, and things like that. The American people do not understand the totality of the challenge and that it is a strategy that is working inside of us. It is a fight for the integrity of the American mind. I'll give you an example. After the Skripal poisoning, where a chemical agent was used on NATO territory, Russian disinformation provided over 46 different explanations of what that could possibly be. If you're an average citizen trying to figure out who, what, where, how, nothing is true, and then everything becomes possible. That was followed up by the Russian hacking of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to try to alter the results of that. This is what is at stake. During the active measures period in the Cold War, the American people knew who the enemy was. There was training and understanding of this. There is none of that, and political polarization
I've only got a
makes it
couple of
worse.
minutes left, but you know, there's arms control treaties in our Defense Department, but what I'm hearing that you're saying is that we, number one, have to build our alliances, and number two, we have to express great clarity about what the threat is. Would you agree with that? Well, I want to thank you. Go ahead. I'm running out of time, but go ahead.
The only thing that's a great line of questioning. Vladimir Putin is neither a Republican nor a Democrat. He does not care. All he cares about is that we become divided and split, and he will continue to work in unprecedented fashions, to allude to an earlier question. I agree with Mike. What happened in 2016 and what I think we can expect to happen in the future in terms of their active measures, their hybrid warfare, is indeed unprecedented. And there's going to be more 9/11s from Russia, in short, and we got to figure out a way to deal with that.
Well, thank you. And before I yield back, I just want to say, Mr. Chairman, I'd be interested in us taking up some of the suggestions that Mr. Lorber made about the illegal moving of money. I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Welch. Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses, not just for being here today, but for your long careers of commitment to this country. Ambassador McFaul, our foreign service oftentimes gets dragged into the mud, and they're doing incredible things in hard places, and most people don't understand what it's like to be targeted by the Russians the way you do. So thank you for that, Mr. Hall. Our colleagues that have to deal in denied areas and work in tough places against an insurmountable foe. Most people can't understand that, nor will they ever understand that. You do, and thank you for bringing your attention to this. And Mr. Lorber and Ms. Conley, thank you for the unsexy work of getting into the details about some of these issues that help inform folks like us. And while I do have a question, I must associate myself with the gentleman from Texas and his letter. Prior to the 2016 election, I was calling for Ambassador Kislyak to be PNG'd from this country. Prior to the 2016 election, I was trying to say how this sustained covert influence operation by the Russians had to be addressed. Grisly step, what the intelligence community refers to the attempts by the Russian government to influence our election, is going to go down in history as the Russian intelligence greatest covert influence operation. Why? Because their goal, and Mr. Hall, you alluded to this, is to erode trust in our democratic institutions. It is to erode trust in the American people and the intelligence services, to erode trust between the intelligence services and the legislative branch. Its goal is to erode trust between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And I've sat here for 22 months and having many of my colleagues question our side of the aisle's commitment and understanding that the Russians is a threat. It's clear, Republicans and Democrats on this committee agree the Russians attempted to influence our election. They tried to do it in 18, they're gonna try to do it in 20, they're doing it in Moldova, they've done it in Armenia, they're gonna continue to do that. And so when we question that, when we imply that there is not an agreement on that particular issue, we are falling into the trap of eroding trust in our institutions. And we have to change our behavior. We have to get at this threat because they are continuing to do it, and they're very good, and we're not prepared for that. And Mr. Hall, my question for you: who is responsible for counter covert influence? And who should be responsible for that in the U.S. government?
I think given how the Russians have evolved in terms of their capabilities, their hybrid warfare, their influence operations, all of those different disciplines, I believe that it actually now in the United States needs to be an all-of-government approach if such a thing is possible. Obviously, we need to have certain folks taking the leads. The intelligence community has to inform what's going on. There's a military component to it because I think we need to protect critical infrastructure. But it touches, the way that the Russians are doing it now, it touches so many different parts of our government and indeed our society that it's got to be a widespread thing. So unfortunately, I don't know that I can name one person, one agency, one organization to do it. It's too broad now.
Thank you. Ambassador McFaul.
All of that said, I also want to make sure, in my view, we understand that the answer to your question is not just an intel question, it's a policy question.
For sure.
The President of the United States needs to stand next to Vladimir Putin and say, we know what you did in 2016, and if you do it again, these are going to be the consequences. And until the President of the United States doesn't do that, it's not good enough for the rest of the Trump administration to try to do that. I know a lot of those people. I think they've got a pretty good policy towards Russia. I actually do. And in some of the things, they were better than us in terms of our policy in the Obama administration. But when the President of the United States, standing right next to him in Helsinki, sides with Putin and not your former colleagues, that does the very damage that you just described about trust in our
Mr. McFaul, I've made my opinions on this topic very clear. But what I will end with, before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I left a job as an undercover officer in the CIA because I was disgusted with the things I had to do and the lack of knowledge that congressional leaders had, and when I had to brief them when I was overseas. I felt that there were people in Congress at that time that were going against the opposite of what my friends and my colleagues were doing, not just in the CIA, but in the military, in our foreign service. And I was disgusted with that, and I said, I gotta try to do something about it. And it's great to be able to help the intelligence community in a different way by serving on this committee. But what we need to do is stop with the innuendo, stop with abusing our position and implying we have access to something that we do not have access. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I would only mention that to my colleague that in the last session, the majority produced a report that suggested to the American people that the intelligence community's conclusion that Russia had intervened, and in fact intervened to help one candidate and hurt the other, should be subject to doubt. That the intelligence community didn't use the proper tradecraft, that conclusion should be called into question. I don't think that was in the service of the country. I don't think that's reflected in any of the intelligence. I don't think that's going to be reflected in Bob Mueller's report. And that was the unanimous opinion of the then majority. Every member of this panel who was a part of that signed that report. And I fully concur, Mr. Hurd, that we need to be very clear about Russian intervention. We need to all condemn it on a bipartisan basis. We should show no daylight in that. We'll never know whether that intervention was decisive in the election. I've never suggested it was. We don't know, and our intelligence community, though the president has represented that that's what they concluded, that's not their job, and of course that wasn't their conclusion. It's beyond their role and their capability to predict election outcomes. Ambassador McFaul?
Would the gentleman yield to
Yes.
Is it normal within the Directorate of Intelligence, or I guess it's now the Directorate of Analysis, for a senior analyst involved in a subject matter to be excluded from the review of all source intelligence on that subject?
Mr. Hurd, you and I can carry on this conversation, or we can ask the experts whether they have any reason to question the intelligence community's assessment that the Russians intervened on one side and not the other. Shall we put it to the witnesses?
I doubt they will have the opportunity to speak on classified materials, but I would love to talk about the process on how intelligence has been developed and how all source intelligence should be developed. And again, there is no question about the ICA assessment about the Russians' attempt to influence our elections. But tradecraft, standards of tradecraft are standards of tradecraft. And when there is a deviation from that standard of tradecraft, we should understand why.
Well, Mr. Castro, you are up next, if you'll indulge me. Let me ask the witnesses, does anyone on this panel question the intelligence community's finding that the Russians intervened in our election and did so for the purpose of helping one candidate and hurting the other?
Would the gentleman yield to add an additional question?
I'd like to allow the witnesses to answer. Does anyone question that? Ms. Conley?
No, I do not question it.
Ambassador?
No
Mr.
question.
Hall? Mr. Lorber? Mr. Castro, you're recognized.
Mr. Castro, would the gentleman yield for 20 seconds, please, sir?
Sure.
I would welcome the gentleman asking the question if any of the panelists knew how the ICA was developed and whether their understanding of the process on which it was vetted through the intelligence agency. And I yield back.
They can give an answer there. I'll let him answer your question, Will.
I have no knowledge of the process.
Neither do I.
I have no direct knowledge, but it would be difficult for me to imagine that the heads of the intelligence organizations would stand up and vouch for it if there were not some integrity to it, but that's speculation on my part.
Likewise, I have no knowledge of the process.
All right. Thank you for y'all's testimony today. I wanted to ask you about sanctions and their effectiveness and whether sanctions in the long term will have an effect on Vladimir Putin's grip on power in Russia and how they're affecting his hold on power in Russia.
Congressman, I'm probably on the pessimistic side of our sanctions regime, as important it is to continue to place those sanctions. I think in many ways, President Putin has used these sanctions as a method of weeding out those that are not loyal to him and more loyal to their bank accounts in the West. He has renationalized important parts of his economy. What he recently announced, and which was met with some fairly significant protests in Russia, he's unplugging from the international system because he understands it's the vulnerability. So the online Iron Curtain, he's removing himself from the online because he knows we have a cyber offensive capability that during the midterm elections we shut down the Internet Research Agency and other things. They are trying to develop now, we're seeing this across the board, the exhaustion of sanctions, that they're creating a separate financial system so that if, the most extreme option, if we were to eliminate them from the international financial transaction system, the SWIFT system, that they would have additional resources to be able to withstand that. So there is a system to prevent the sanctions from impacting them completely, and I think this is where What we are suggesting in our report, what Eric has been suggesting, is we now need a new set of tools to actually prevent Russian money laundering and illicit financing from being housed and sheltered in our systems. And that could be a very robust way of responding to Russian aggression in its many forms.
Can I?
Sure.
Ambassador?
Do you mind if I build on Heather's comments? Because I think there is a risk of what I term sanctions atrophy in two ways. One, to Heather's point about evasion techniques, the Russians are very good about using front and shell companies, and they're only getting better. So as she said, that in the last 2 years, you've seen significant innovation. The other issue, which I think is important to flag in terms of the long-term consequences and long-term impact of these tools, in Russia in particular, is that the longer that the European Union maintains its sanctions program, the less likely that over time they're going to renew. The way the EU sanctions work is that there is a 6-month period, and at the end of that 6 months, they have to renew these sanctions, the sectoral sanctions they have in place. As time goes on, and as the sanctions don't seem to be having a significant impact and change in Russian behavior, you're hearing increasing calls from particular EU member states to not renew. And because it's a unanimous decision that's required in the EU, if there is the opportunity to peel off 1 or 2 significant European countries, you could see a significant fracturing of the transatlantic unity on the sanctions regime.
Thank you. Ambassador?
Just a couple of comments. I think it's wrong to assume because Putin hasn't changed his behavior that Russians support the sanctions and support Putin. Individuals, I know many of the people many of the people on the sanctions list. I have to see them in third countries now, as I already talked about, because I'm on the sanctions list. But I think it's important to understand that there's a real division among them about the wisdom of the belligerent behavior that Putin did and that they're suffering for it. They'll tell you that privately, but for all the reasons we've been discussing for the last couple hours, they would never do that publicly. But remember, that sentiment is there among the elites. Number 2, polling data in Russia is flawed. Most of the polling companies are controlled by the government, and remember, it's a heavily surveilled country. So when you're sitting out in Novosibirsk and Ivan Ivanovich calls you from Moscow and he says, hey, what do you think of Putin? There's only one rational answer to that, right? You support him. That said, even with that flawed data, his numbers are going down. The rallying around the flag effect of the war in Ukraine and calling us the enemy because of sanctions, that is dissipating. And in Russia, they talk about it, the divide between, the fight between the television, which is the propaganda, and the refrigerator. And I would never be so unwise as to try to predict when that moves in a way that changes his behavior, but the numbers are moving in this way, and there's a real despondency, both among elites and growing in society, about this period of stagnation that Russia is in.
Thanks. Are you back?
Mr. Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your dignity and strength in the face of some truly ridiculous remarks that were made this morning. And I think it's ironic that our colleagues on the other side bristled at the notion that they didn't care as much about Russian influence in our elections, or malign influence generally, and yet not a single one of them remains to join the conversation with some of the leading experts in the world. I think that speaks volumes. And I also think that if their position is that the improper, unethical, and unpatriotic conduct of the president wasn't criminal, and that therefore is some cause for celebration, well, I just have a very different view of it, and I, for one, appreciate very much the temerity you've shown to ask some questions about that in your role as the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Gentlemen, and Ms. Conley, thank you so much for your appearance here today. We really do value your expertise. We depend on it. Thank you for your service. My question is to Ambassador McFaul, but anyone should feel free to answer it. You spoke earlier about the prescriptive measures that we should be taking. What would those look like? If you were advising the president today and that president was going to follow that advice, what were the top 2 or 3 things you said we are not doing now that we should be doing?
Thanks for the question. We'll have a big report with a group of Stanford colleagues coming out shortly, and I'll make sure everybody gets a copy of it. We briefly summarized it in a piece in the Washington Post, which I'll make sure everybody gets. It was published yesterday with one of your members, by the way, Ro Khanna, and my colleague Alex Stamos, who used to be the head of security at Facebook. Let me just go through a couple of the things. starting with the most important, cybersecurity infrastructure for our electoral infrastructure. We've done some measures, but not nearly enough in order to make sure that the votes that are cast are the ones that we are able to count. And even on the voting rolls, by the way, remember, Russia doesn't have to do, and I don't want to say Russia, Putin, because it's not all Russia. And by the way, not all Russians, let me just add a footnote to something I said earlier. I want to correct the record. I think it's very important to remember that not all Russians are corrupt. There are many Russians doing legitimate business with Americans, and we need to be careful to be precise when we're talking about that, because I was not precise earlier. But back to this, Putin doesn't need to steal 78,000 votes, right? All he needs is for a few thousand people to show up to vote and their name's not on the roll, and then there's camera crews and there's what's going on. That will undermine the integrity of the election, and we have done very little on that. Number two, basic cyber hygiene for people that work on campaigns. I don't want to put people on the spot, but there are very, very simple things one can do. Dual authentication is the most basic, that are not required by law or even norms. That's an easy thing that we should do. Number three, de-amplifying what happens on the social media platforms of these campaigns. Now, notice I didn't say ban them. I think that's a much more difficult thing. But I interact with all those companies in the Silicon Valley, and I think there are ways that they can de-amplify when they expose those things. But then the number 3 or 4 that I'm on, one of the things they would say if they were here is we didn't know about the activity on our platforms because there was not enough coordination between the intelligence community and the private sector. And I think setting up that coordination, maybe with third parties involved to make sure there's no conflict of interest, that would be another thing to do. Another really big debate we have to have is what is the norms of allowing foreign governments to participate in our electoral procedures. You know, I said earlier, Sputnik International, completely controlled by the Kremlin, tweets out #CrookedHillary. That's obviously trying to influence a campaign. What do we do to prevent that kind of activity? I could go on, but I'll
those are very helpful. But I guess I'd invite you, and the others should feel free to join in terms of more significant responses by the U.S. government. I mean, those are prophylactic measures that make a lot of sense to me. But should we have a red line on cyber attacks in this country? Should we make it very clear that if a bomb went off at the DNC and the Russians did it, they would expect a response, and if they engage in this kind of activity, that they should expect a response? And what could that look like if we were truly committed to bloodying their nose so they didn't do it again?
So my brief answer, I'll let my colleagues jump in. The answer to that is yes, that's deterrence. There may have been more of that in 2016 than we know on the record, by the way, because the Obama administration was very focused on Election Day. What would the contours be? I want to be careful about commenting on the record about that. In many ways, it's important to have that conversation off the record with the Russians. But you can't have it if you're not acknowledging that the Russians did it in the first place. And I think the first step would be for the President of the United States to acknowledge on the record what happened and say that there'll be grave consequences and then talk about those consequences privately. One other thing I want to say, just because I have the microphone, I also want more transparency about interactions with Russians and other governments. And we've been focused on Russia rightly, but I want to remind you that there are other actors out there that have an interest in destabilizing and delegitimating our elections. I don't want to ban interaction between Americans and foreigners, including Russians, but I think during campaigns, we should require, either through norms or maybe even legislation, transparency about those interactions.
Congressman, if I just make 3 brief, what we've heard repeatedly, the United States government has to restructure fundamentally for this challenge. We are set up to fight terrorism. We are not set up to fight malign influence, which is perfected by Russian statecraft today. It'll be Beijing statecraft. I mean, this is not going to go away. This is our vulnerability. So there has to be a fundamental restructuring, which includes intelligence, but it also includes the seam between domestic and foreign. That's where this falls into, and that's where we have important laws to prevent and make sure there's a separation, but that's where they're working. We have to inform the American people. Again, to Congressman Welch's point, we have to talk about this so Americans are literate and armed with what's going on, so they can read their news feeds in an educated way. They can understand what's going on. And third, and this is what's been missing for quite some time, we have to have an offensive strategy. Once we return our confidence in our democracy and our market economy to, as what Ronald Reagan said, we have to return to the city on the hill. We want for the Russian people what we want for the Ukrainian people, which is freedom for them to choose their leaders and their way of life, however they wish. We haven't been on offense for a long time. That is what won the Cold War in many ways. We helped solidarity movements. We kept faith with civil society. We told them we stand for something better. That's what's been missing in our strategy.
My time has expired. If the chairman will allow Mr. Hall to respond, it'd be...
Mr. Hall?
Just two brief things. First of all, I agree with everything that Mike and Heather said. We have to make the Russians, and specifically Vladimir Putin, understand that the price that he would pay, that Russia would pay, would be exceedingly high if they attempt something like that again. The details as to how that happens hopefully is already underway in our government, but that's one thing. And the second thing is we've got to do it in coordination with our allies. That amplifies it so much more. It's pretty much that simple. The devil's in the details, but that's what I would recommend.
Thanks. I would say that we need to work to deputize the private sector. And by that I mean there's a lot of focus today on what the intelligence community can do and what law enforcement can do, and those capabilities are tremendous. But one of the greatest force multipliers we have are individuals in financial institutions throughout the world who are looking for this type of illicit activity every day. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people. To the extent that you can provide them with the tools, whether it be legal authorities or obligations to pull information that shows or helps better illustrate where the Russians are hiding assets, how they're attacking our democracy, how they're moving funds, that's incredibly important and will pay significant dividends above and beyond what we already have.
Thank you.
Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being with us today. You know, as a former law enforcement officer and now a member of Congress, I think often about a quote that says, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing." At the beginning of this hearing, the chairman outlined a list of behaviors that I believe any reasonable person would find inappropriate, especially as it pertains to our national security. That is a #1 concern for me. However, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have lamented over the suggestion that they don't care about those behaviors. Well, as a former police chief, when inappropriate, criminal, unethical behavior was brought to my attention, I did something about it. You don't sit silent and do nothing and work hard to either find a technicality to discredit the witnesses or remind a former ambassador to the United States of America that he's under oath. You don't do that. You work diligently in the pursuit of justice and protecting this country. You hold people accountable who engage in wrongdoing regardless of who they are. And so I'm delighted to be a member of Congress, but disappointed at the direction that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, we've got to do this together, chose to take this morning. There is one team for this committee especially, and that's to protect the American team. With that, thank you for allowing me to get that out. It's been painful. Ms. Conley and Mr. Hall, are there any notable instances of the Kremlin using malign financial influence abroad that have not been discussed yet, that we haven't had the time to discuss? that you would like to?
Well, the report that we've passed out to you, it really dives into at least the use and focusing on concentrated sectors of energy, finance, real estate, how it works, how it metastasizes. This is a shared problem. We focus on Europe, but this is a transatlantic challenge. So I welcome you to read that, and if there's any questions that we can follow up and provide those that have been on the front lines, which are many of our European colleagues that have watched this type of malign influence work within their countries for quite some time. So I'm happy to follow up with you and give you those specific details.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Any in particular?
I have less specifics than I do just in terms of modus operandi. I mean, the Russians do not hesitate, would never hesitate to use any of their intelligence services to identify individuals and organizations where they see an opportunity to carry out that type of malign activity. It's, again, a different system than we have here. Our intelligence agencies here, for the most part, collect information for policymakers. In Russia, they collect it to do precisely that type of malign activity.
Thank you. Again, Ms. Conley, is there anything in our financial, legal, or regulatory system that makes the United States particularly vulnerable to tactics used by the Kremlin?
So the one we certainly highlight is the incorporation. We highlight the Netherlands, which is a vast tax incorporation. We could see similarities in the state of Delaware, to be perfectly honest with you. So this is where I said it's not a pointing of fingers, it's a shared issue that we have to greatly heighten transparency on beneficial ownership. I think this is legislation that has been around for quite some time. I hope we give you all the national security imperative to highlight the transparency of beneficial ownership. We also argue in our report that what we need is basically a financial intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance system. And I'm using, technically the terms of warfare. That's how we allow our military to have a common operating picture where they can see the different aspects of it. We need that financially so we can see where the red light is blipping in the Estonian branch and Danske Bank, which is money laundering, which is being, buying real estate, using its malign influence to help fund political parties and other activities to help harm the nation. So we have to create a better common operating picture. This gets back to my concern about we are not structured to do this. Exactly to Eric's point, this has to be a shared public-private partnership. I think the banks and others want help in doing this because the problem is so massive they can't meet that challenge. I think on cyber, the same thing. The technology companies want help, want a partnership to try to combat this malign influence. It's very evasive, and it's going to be very difficult to root out.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, may the ambassador.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Just one quick point to underscore something Steve said a couple hours ago that I think is very important analytically, is don't put the Western lens on how Russia works the way that we think about it. So we have some lines of authority and lines of jurisdiction between what Steve used to do and what I used to do, right? Russia doesn't have that. It's all blurred, and there's varying degrees. By the way, the president of Russia is also a former KGB officer, and everything, therefore, is blurred. And just always constantly remind yourself when you're looking to understand what's happening here, it's a very different system, completely dominated these days by the Russian intelligence services.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll associate myself with the comments of Mr. Maloney, and I'm actually glad that Mr. Turner brought Senator McCarthy into the conversation. History will clarify what has happened, and some of the smaller details will be elided, but if my Republican colleagues are betting that the chairman, who is a good friend to all of us and a man of deep, deep integrity, will play the role of Joseph McCarthy in the historical interpretation, rather than a president who regularly calls the press the enemy of the people, who regularly attacks the Department of Justice, the FBI, the CIA, and discredits them when they don't provide information that is consistent with his personal interests, who says there are very fine people on both sides of a Nazi march in Charlottesville. If that's their bet, I will take the other side of that bet. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your your spirited response to outrageous behavior on the part of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. With that, to the panel, thank you for being here. I want to just take a little bit of time to get a little bit more detail around the role that the Russian banks play in this. And I want to quickly just read a quote from a BuzzFeed document dump. It's a letter to Michael Cohen from Felix Sater. And I'm just going to read one line. This is in reference to Trump Tower, and it's not Trump Tower I'm concerned with here, but Mr. Sater writes, Kostik, who is Putin's top finance guy and CEO of the second largest bank in Russia, is on board and has indicated he would finance Trump Moscow. This is major for us, not only the financing aspect, but Kostin's position in Russia, extremely powerful and respected. A quote that sort of implies that there's a really rich and deep partnership between the Kremlin and this bank. I also was personally involved in the discussion of the lifting of sanctions on EN and Rusal, which involved Deripaska transferring 14% of his ownership in EN to VTB Bank. So there's just two facts that show what feels like a family relationship between the Kremlin, between banks and oligarchs. And so let me start with Mr. Conley. I think this is your area of expertise. Can you just talk a little bit about how that relationship, Kremlin-controlled banks, but also banks that are maybe not Kremlin-controlled, with respect to providing financing for projects, providing support to oligarchs, and maybe even doing the service of the Kremlin, as is implied in Mr. Sater's letter here?
Thank you, Representative Himes. I'm actually not a Russia-specific financial expert, but my understanding is, as you laid out, that there's a very close connection in the way, for example, that Russian oligarchs are able to access financing from entities like Sberbank, from VTB, from VEB. But I'll defer to the other witnesses on the question of how specifically those causal mechanisms are working.
Ambassador, do you have a view?
Sure, I can talk about that. I know Mr. Kostin. I know VTB. That was part of my job as the U.S. ambassador, to help us understand those kind of activities. And I think it's important to understand that VTB is a completely controlled bank. I'm not even sure the word bank is the right word for it. That's part of, even the language I'm not sure we should be using. But we'd do whatever President Putin called them to do. Now, they had other aspirations long ago at VTB. And VTB Capital to expand in these other directions. They had other aspirations to privatize. I know that that was a plan that they had years ago. All those plans have been set aside, and so the thing you're quoting, that's very consistent. I don't know the specifics of that case, I want to be clear, but that it would be very consistent with the general way that I know that the Kremlin works with the three major banks.
Ms. Conley, do you have a...
So, Congressman, our research has looked at how Russian influence manifests itself in Europe. So our expertise looks at, in some ways, how that Russian financing goes through European institutions. So, for one example, before the 2014 European Parliament elections, we saw where Russian finance went through the first Czech Russian bank, which is now defunct, to provide funds to Marine Le Pen's campaign prior to that election. We are also watching how Europeans, actually, this is both for Unicredit, Italy's largest bank, also Austria's banks, they're actually growing in size within Russia. And again, we didn't think we'd anticipate that 5 years after the annexation of Crimea, but actually European state-owned champions, energy and banking, are actually growing in their size, and that creates a risk to them. So that's my knowledge, comes from how the European banking structure is amplifying a lot of the Russian financing.
So I'm out of time, but very, very quick question. It sounds like one of the things we should do, and maybe other committees in this in the Congress should do, is investigate or at least propagate the idea that if you secure financing from a Russian entity, there may be strings attached. It could ultimately be used, and I'm looking at you, Mr. Hill, as a mechanism of compromise and therefore be a counterintelligence concern. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think your description of of it being a family affair is good if you recognize the families, the Cosa Nostra. So it's like a mob relationship. It's not to say that all business contact with banks, I think, are false and are somehow suspect, but they could be compromised at any moment with that phone call from the Kremlin.
Ambassador.
Chairman, because I didn't mention Deripaska, you mentioned him. I would just say on that case, when I followed fairly closely, two things. One, when people say sanctions don't work, they most certainly worked with Mr. Deripaska. He lost billions of dollars, and allegedly, this is just in the reporting, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to get off that sanctions list. So remember that. But number two, I think we need to understand how he did get off that sanctions list. You mentioned the restructuring that was done. This is very mysterious to me, why that was done, because it's always been my view, both as an academic and as a former policymaker, that sanctions are put in place to change the behavior of the target country that you're sanctioning. Putin has not changed his behavior, yet for some reason, the sanctions were lifted on Mr. Deripaska's firms. I think we should know more about exactly how that happened.
I agree. Thank you, Ambassador. I yield back.
Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just compliment you, first of all, for holding this hearing in the open so that the American people can begin to understand the threats that Russia has against our country. And let me also say that you showed extraordinary restraint with some of the viciousness that was exemplified by, regrettably, some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I also note, as does my colleague, that no one is here from the Republican side of the aisle. That's very unusual. Normally, there's always a representative of the Republican side of the aisle at hearings. I think it suggests a bit of stuntmanship that went on earlier. Let me also point out that the Barr letter specifically says that the Mueller report outlines the Russia efforts to influence the election. Clearly stated. Now, we don't have the underpinnings of that yet, but we should all wait to see that. The report by the Republican majority at the time said, and I quote, "The intelligence community assessment judgments on Putin's strategic intentions did not employ proper analytical tradecraft." So on the one hand, they will accept the Mueller report, but their own report suggested that it was inadequate. Let me just ask Ms. Conley, thank you so much for your work. I'm curious about the Raiffeisen Bank in Austria. You spend a whole chapter on Austria and the banks. Could you express to us the relationship of Russia to the Raiffeisen Bank?
So again, it's a general pattern that we see a close relationship that has been in the makings for decades. And this was in some ways Austria's very unique role in being, as they say, neither east nor west, neutral. And they were able to do quite a bit of trade. What we're seeing in the banking structures is really Austria's ability to amplify that Russian funding and take it elsewhere within Europe. So Austria is very powerfully placed their banking system across Central Europe in the Western Balkans. And this is, to be honest with you, why we did the second research book, the Kremlin Playbook 2, is that we kept seeing Austrian firms, their banks, and their energy firms repeatedly appearing throughout our first research. So we wanted to take a deeper dive in two types of banks. Raiffeisen Bank, because of its size and its great importance to the region, amplifies non-transparency, and Austria has very unique and special.
Let me interrupt you for a moment. The Raiffeisen Bank actually funded a Toronto Trump project for $300 million and never came back after that project went bankrupt to secure what it could in bankruptcy in terms of the return of their funds. Is that commonplace?
So, Congresswoman, we've studied how it works within Europe. We did not identify any specific structural arrangement outside of Europe.
Thank you. Ambassador, thank you again for your outstanding comments today. To what extent is Putin personally aware of Russian individuals who are engaged in money laundering in U.S. real estate?
I don't want to speculate. I don't know for sure. He most certainly wouldn't share that information with me personally. But knowing generally how the system works, I think he would be acutely aware of those kinds of things. He's a man of detail. I was always struck by that in my interactions with him when I was in the government, usually accompanying President Obama or other members of our administration. So I would, again, it would be very consistent that he would know about those things, but I don't know for sure. Maybe Steve knows.
Mr. Hall?
I think that the term acutely aware, that's a good term. Yeah, anything that's of critical importance to him in splitting the West and splitting the United States and dividing us, he would take a great interest in.
So if a number of LLCs are created that are based in which ownership of the real estate in the United States is by Russians, there is potentially a likelihood that Putin knows about it.
There certainly could be.
All right.
It would stand to reason, yes.
Would Putin ever authorize an oligarch to purchase a U.S. property at an inflated price as compromat, Mr. Ambassador?
I know the case you're talking about, and I don't know the answer to that. That's a great question. We should get our intelligence community to help you get the answer to that question. I personally don't know.
Thank you. Mr. Hall?
That would be consistent with how the Russian intelligence services function.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Are there any further questions from my colleagues? Yes, Ms.
Can I ask just one last question? I think the comments that many of you made about the porousness of our election system and the Russian ability to not only get into the voting rolls, but conceivably into the voting machines, is something that the American people really care about. And yet it has not gotten the attention it deserves. We have 4 companies that basically have a lock on all the voting machines in this country. There's no requirement for audits, for paper ballots, for the kind of optical scanning. Do any of you have confidence that the Russians would not, maybe I'm saying this wrong, knowing that and the vulnerabilities, is that something that clearly the Russians would take full advantage of if they could?
Yes, they absolutely would. And in fairness to those companies and others who are trying to do these protective measures, which are important defensively, we have to understand that the way our open society is set up and the way that the internet functions, it's designed to share information as efficiently as possible. So this is a real struggle when you're trying to protect really critical information. Having worked in an organization that really wants to protect its information, it's a really hard thing to do when you're talking about systems that are designed to share. How you get around that is how you defend against that is a really difficult thing, but I don't think you can do it unless you also have that offensive thing that we were talking about before, letting the Russians know, look, we're going to defend, but if we catch you, the price you're going to pay is brutal. That 1-2 thing is the only thing I think we can do.
Well, Congressman, I think looking at what Europe has done, it's the redundancy of the paper ballot that is absolutely essential because, and in fact, in many European countries, they still, I mean, it seems so archaic to what we should be doing in the fantastic technologies we have, but they do require that redundancy of paper just to make sure, again, it's about ensuring confidence that every vote is there. So I think there could be some redundancy very helpfully to that process.
And if I could just add to that, if I may, absolutely paper trail for every ballot. That seems like a complete no-brainer, and that we haven't done that yet is shocking to me. But I also want to remind you that there are a lot of other actors copying the Putin playbook now, including domestic actors, and we need to be aware of the fact that we could have multiple actors trying to disrupt our elections in 2020, and that's why I think it's so vital that we focus on these prescriptive measures now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for accommodating me.
I thank you, and Ambassador, on that point, one of the issues that our committee is investigating is the development of the deepfake technology. My paramount concern during 2016, as we were watching what the Russians were doing in real time, the hacking and the dumping of these documents, is that they were going to begin dumping forgeries among the real. That concern now is heightened exponentially, given that this new technology would allow the Russians or any other foreign actor or any other malicious domestic actor to push out in proximity to an election video or audio which is completely a forged product. but nonetheless has all the indicia of veracity and reliability. When we consider just how disruptive that would be, the Russians don't need to hack our elections infrastructure, although it is all too vulnerable. Pushing out that kind of false content could be far more influential. And we're in a race right now of technologies, the technology to develop deepfakes and the technology to detect them. And I'm deeply concerned, given just how polarized the country is, the electorate is, indeed our committee is, that our ability to respond to that is very much in doubt. And psychologists will tell you, once you have seen a video, even if you're later persuaded intellectually that the video is a fake, you cannot undo the impression and the lingering impact of that. So we're entering a brave new world, and what we need is a whole-of-government approach that looks at what each and every agency is doing to protect the country and to protect the integrity of our democratic institutions, that is working collaboratively, that is talking to each other. We need the public to be more critical of what they learn on social media, and this needs to be a comprehensive effort. Your testimony today has been very, very helpful in informing us of the task ahead. And I want to thank you for appearing today, and more than that, I want to thank you for your service to the country. We are adjourned.